I was initially going to pick Every Time I Die, but I know how really nerdy I can get on that. I mean, I know no one, you can't see behind me, but all the way. But there's right behind me is a photo that a friend of mine took from the Eats It show that I did the first show review I did, and I subsequently got that tattooed on me.
Nice.
So, but then you said someone else is already going to do it. I was like, all right. So I guess if
well, we might get 2 or 3 people on for that one because that's a big one for us. Typically, whenever we do a band that has that big of a following, it's one of those like the episode might not do that well initially, but over time, people Googling Every Time I Die and all that, they kind of start picking up on it and seeing what we got to say.
Yeah, and we can commiserate. You said earlier, retail management. Dan and I have both been in that before.
Hooray for not working weekends and holidays anymore.
No fucking shit, dude. Oh my God, I used to be the biggest fucking Grinch for the longest time, and people couldn't understand why. I'm like, fuck you. I'm like, you do it and see if you're not a Grinch.
And if you were the biggest fucking Grinch for a long time, then you are ready for this episode of Discography Discussion. I am Joe. That is Dan. That is Geoff. This is Jon Beatty of Jons Untitled Podcast.
Is it Beatty or Betty? I never asked.
Beatty like Warren Beatty.
Warren Beatty.
God, I knew that A was going to fuck me. Anyway.
That's what she said.
Oh. Wow. Mark the time. What are we, 30 seconds in and we already got a That's What She Said joke?
That's the only one I'm allowed.
Oh, you're allowed one an episode? I thought he was going to pull out a t-shirt that said That's What She Said. I was going to taking the joke even further.
Just give me some time.
I say, give him some time and I guarantee it'll happen.
I mean, if we want to make this the first nude podcast, we can.
Oh, this would definitely not be the first nude podcast.
Oh my God, the bullshit button doesn't work.
No, I'm just sweating like.
All right.
Anyway, thanks for having me on.
We're glad to have you, man.
Anytime.
We like talking about moobs.
Oh man, I got a sweet set of A cups for you.
Oh yeah,
they're real whether you like them or not.
Fucking amateur.
That's what the A stands for.
Yeah. Oh.
Nice.
Actually, speaking of A, I believe we are talking about As I Lay Dying. Speaking of A cups and moves.
That's correct.
Oh, I thought we were talking about metalcore.
We are talking about. Well, no, Joe, we're talking about As I Lay Dying.
Oh, it's the same thing.
Yeah, so the metal and the underwire of his bra.
Yes, for the boobs that he now has.
Yes.
Oh my God, that's terrible. Sorry, Tim.
That would be 2 minutes and 25 seconds in. It already came up.
Oh, we're going to try to just talk about the band at first. I realize that probably the last half hour of this podcast is going to be talking about that.
Well, I mean, for good reason,
there'll be a lot of shitting on him.
Just to say, something that you and I talked to you about, Dan, was just the impact of him going to jail and the separation. And actually, fuck it, we'll just get to that later. But there's a bigger arc about that, though.
Absolutely. So, As I Lay Dying, does anybody remember the first time they heard As I Lay Dying?
Can I go first?
Sure, go ahead.
All right, so back when Hot Topic used to have that 8 CDs that you could listen to and they were on sale, I walked in there and the album cover for Frail Lord's Collapse caught my attention, and I listened to that and Most Precious Blood's Our Lady of Annihilation album, and basically those 2 records coming out shaped me going into metalcore and really extreme metal, going with As I Lay Dying and everything that they were about, like bands like Himza. And then Most Precious Blood got me into bands like Hatebreed and a lot more of that East Coast hardcore. So very, very memorable time frame for me.
I know I became first aware of them when I heard another band, probably Killswitch Engage, and Dan, of all people, says, this sounds like As I Lay Dying. So I started listening to As I Lay Dying, and I said, okay, so every song sounds the same. And it's heavy, and it's melodic, and all right, this is going to be the thing for the next 5 years.
Gothenburg, Sweden called. They want their riffs back.
Yeah, the first time I heard them was actually at Mobap in my friend's dorm room. He's really big into anything Christian and anything that's heavy. So, I mean, this was, at that time, was right up his alley. And I think that came out Frail World's... This Frail Words Collapse, I think, is what he had me listen to.
Was that 2003?
No, it wasn't 2003. It was 2004, 2005 when he had me listen to it, but I think that was the first one that I listened to. It wasn't Shadows Are Security. I think was out, but I don't think he had it yet. I don't know. I'm an old fart. I don't remember anything.
This is back when you still had to pick and choose what CDs you were going to buy, so you had to wait sometimes.
Yeah, we had this cool place here in, I don't know if they were everywhere, but in St. Louis, this place called CD Warehouse.
Oh, yeah.
And they were real good about allowing you to listen to it before you buy it. And I know we did plenty of that afterwards. We just kind of like went to our local CD warehouse and sat down for a couple hours just listening to everything and buying nothing.
They're still around.
Yeah, there's a couple. Yeah,
I just bought some Napalm Death records for them.
Nice.
Yeah.
I just know the other places I lived in the U.S., I never saw them where I used to live.
They were around for a very short amount of time here in the Midwest.
Well, the first time I heard As I Lay Dying, 2002. I was a member of and contributed a little bit to a website called godcore.com because I was a hardcore
Godcore.
Christian hardcore fan, and I was eating it all up. That was like really a big time for me. And I read a review for a CD called Beneath the Encasing of Ashes by a band called As I Lay Dying. And back then I was using like a really shitty connection. It might have been like a broadband, but it was like not like a really great internet connection, so I couldn't stream the song. So I had to just imagine what I thought that they were going to sound like, based on the review. Because, back in the day, you used to read CD reviews, and then you would base your purchase on that. And so I went to the band's website, I contacted them, I ordered a CD, and they sent me this.
Okay.
Beneath the Encasing of Ashes, which is weird because I had no idea that this is like a rare CD now.
Yeah.
Like,
they didn't sign it?
Like a hard to find. They did not sign it, no.
Oh, what assholes.
But I know, right? I knew Tim was a bad apple from the very beginning. No, but the whole thing is that... So I heard the CD, and I remember thinking, well, this just sounds like Zao. Like, they should have mentioned that in the review, that it sounds just like Zao. I already love Zao. Like they're no secret on the podcast that Zao is my favorite band. I love them. They can do no wrong. And so I think originally I was a little bit put off by how much like Zao it sounded. That first record is it's got more of that like old school metalcore sound to it, which I actually appreciated listening to it again. For this podcast, because
same here.
Yeah. So, and yeah, we've just rolled into the to the first album discussion on that. But yeah, that was the first record that I heard by them, and they were. I wouldn't say they were mind blowing yet. I noticed that there was a little bit of potential. I remember one thing that I liked was the sound clip at the beginning of the record, and there was just kind of this like dirty, gritty sound, and they did a lot of like more of the chaotic metalcore stuff. They sounded a little bit more like Zao with like the chaos and the dissonance, but they sounded a little bit, there was a little bit of like the Ludacris or Norma Jean type of sound in there. And I remember just thinking like, okay, this is all right. I thought this was okay. And listening to it in 2018, I'm kind of like, well, Tim's vocals were sloppy, there's actual mistakes, on the record, and it sounds a little chopped together. It was at the very beginning of like digital recording, and so it sounds a little bit like a little too loud in places and a little too quiet in other places. But what did you guys think? Since it seems like everybody else here has been exposed to the band after they were already really good. What you guys thought about, some of that early material.
Are we diving straight into Frail World's Collapse?
No, we're diving. We're doing Encasing of Ashes, the first album.
We are way back here. I actually don't have access to that.
Yeah, you do. It's they re-released it, Joe, as A Long March.
Oh, yeah, that too.
It has that and the split and a couple.
Okay, well, pretend I didn't kill the conversation and go ahead, Geoff.
This split.
Oh, was I supposed to grab my vinyl and all that stuff too and showcase all my stuff?
No,
dude,
I know a show and tell.
Do you have the split on vinyl?
I'm just being a geek.
No, I don't have. I have the two reissues of Real Words and Shadows of Security on vinyl.
I was gonna shit a brick if you had the split on vinyl. I was gonna.
I don't think it exists on vinyl.
I don't think it did either. But I was like, holy shit! If that really exists, I'm gonna have to find it and buy it.
No. I mean, I have the first Korn test press on vinyl.
Well, you should send that to me to look at, and then
I mean, I have it on my Instagram. You can look at.
There you go.
And before we start talking about things that people should send Dan so he can look at them, I'm going to take this time to say thank you to everyone for listening to the podcast. Thank you for listening and for subscribing. If you are not a subscriber, you can find everything Discography Discussion at discussmetal.com. We are on Google Play, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, so if you have an Amazon Echo or Google Home, you have no excuse. Ask it to play the latest episode of the Discography Discussion podcast, and it will. We're also on Facebook and on Twitter at Discuss Metal. Be sure to like, favorite, and subscribe. It really helps us out. It lets us know you're listening. And now Dan is going to tell you all about 5-star reviews.
We love 5-star reviews here on Discography Discussion. Reviews are great. Everybody always asks me, what can we do to promote your podcast? The best thing you can do, leave us a review. Reviews help. Review numbers actually help us show up in search results and things like that. So if you have an opinion about our podcast, leave it to us.
And now John's going to tell us all about Jons Untitled podcast.
I get confused for John Drake, formerly of the Talk to Me podcast, where people come to my Twitter and tell me that I'm a fat fucking piece of shit. And tell me that I shouldn't talk about metal because I only like new metal. So if that sounds like what you love listening to, then go to the Talk to Me podcast. And otherwise, no, I'm kidding. That did happen though. Someone actually thought it was John Drake.
I remember that. Yeah, there's a whole controversy.
It really was.
Shut the fuck up, Tony. You're out of your element.
This dude blew up all my socials for about 40 minutes around 3 o'clock in the morning one day. And I was like, what the fuck? What did I do? And then I realized he thought it was John Drake. And I go, oh, okay.
Good.
You got the wrong dude. But anyway, my podcast, very much in the vein of some of the stuff that these guys do, talk about a lot of the bands that I love. We're talking about As Lay Dying. That's a band that I've loved for a long time. Metalcore, even some new metal stuff. I've kind of have covered it all. I have a lot of wide-ranging guests. We have had Jared Montague on, someone that you guys have had on. I actually just talked to Dez from Devil Driver yesterday.
Nice.
We got a lot of we. Why do I say we? It's just me. But collectively, the we of my podcast, which is me, we talked to a lot of different people about a lot of different things. I had Lauren from Sharptooth on. We talked about how much you would pay to drink your own piss, if that's something you're into. I had Andy Williams from Every Time I Die on to talk about his wrestling career and just wrestling in general. I've had a lot of people on. So I think if you like this podcast, if you like the Talk to Me podcast, if you like the Roach Coach, if you like a lot of the podcasts that have been on this podcast, I think you'll like what I'm doing over there. And if not, you can hit me up on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever, and tell me that I fucking suck. And that's fine with me too.
As long as you talked about Cold Chamber with Dez, we're good.
I did not. No, actually I didn't.
What? You suck.
It's okay. That leaves an opportunity for us.
No, actually, we talked about the new record that's not out yet, the Country Outlaw record, the Outlaws album that he is putting out. And I got to say, it's actually probably one of the more aggressive Devil Driver records you're probably going to hear this year. And probably like stacks up against the heaviest thing they've ever put out.
Really?
And it's a covers record. Yeah, it's fucking solid. And I know a lot of people on the internet and so forth have been like, oh, fucking sellouts, and everyone, with Burn the Priest, and for those who can't see me, Burn the Priest in finger quotes, aka Lamb of God, putting out their covers record. A lot of bands putting out cover records now. Even the band we're talking about, As Lay Dying, has put out Decus or however you say that album, and that was basically a partial covers record as well.
Yep.
And it is one of those things where I think it's very much of the time to showcase where a band has come from and the things that they got into to get them into their own thing. But I really gotta say, this new Devil Driver record, I think is gonna really shock some people, and I think it's gonna be on a lot of people's year-ends list.
Really?
Lee fucking Ving, Brock Lindow from 36 Crazy Fists, like, sounds so fucking soulful on the song that he's on. It's so fucking good. Mark Morton lays down some tasty solos on the song that he's on. Randy from Lamb of God sounds great. Like, there's so many great guests, and spoiler, there might be a sequel.
Huh.
Nice. You had me at Brock Lindow.
You know what? So here's the thing. Honestly, not mentioning names, but I think, with people that I've had on my podcast and people that have toured with Dez over the handful of years that he's been touring for over 25 years now.
Yeah, it's been about that.
Yeah, I've had the pleasure of talking to some people that have toured with him and that know him, and there are some people that had me kind of worried, saying that like he's very reserved and very quiet and to himself. And there was actually a story that I never told on my chat with him, where on Ozfest the year it was free, and Double Driver was on the second stage with bands like Behemoth and Hatebreed, and actually that's where I met Mike the Miz.
So the good bands.
Nice.
Yeah, it was a solid year, and a friend of mine was tour managing this band Onkla, who used to be Puya, if you remember that band.
Hell yeah.
And so I went out a couple of times that year to go see my friend and go see Ozfest. And the interesting thing about all that was we spent collectively, between two of my friends and I, we spent about $300 on alcohol and brought it into Ozfest because we didn't pay for tickets. And most people weren't interested in anything we had to offer. Like I had like a nice like $60 bottle of Jack Daniels, and people were like, Jack Daniels, can't do it. And I was like, okay. And Randy from Lamb of God skated by on his longboard. And then long and short of it, I came back after Lamb of God set, and I came back and all of our booze had been drank with all the, like a graveyard of Hatebreed shot glasses, the Hatebreed Jaeger shot glasses. Those like little plastic things that they could toss out for free and shit. And I was like, what the fuck? And then I went to Ramon from Onkla, and I'm like, what the fuck happened? He goes, oh, sorry. We drank all your alcohol. Hope that's okay. And I want to be like, I mean, it's not like I can be like, can you give it back to me?
You don't want it back. Not the way you're going to get it.
No. Yeah, it's coming out of one of two ends, and I don't want either one of those. But what was interesting, though, is that actually, a side tangent. So AJ Barrett from X Still Remains, who was with the Showdown at that point, when the Showdown was still a big Christian metal band. The two times I went and saw Ozfest, they did not show up. One, because they were drunk. Second time, because they were getting tattoos on their buses. Be that as it may.
Okay.
But I remember I was talking with AJ, and he was like, oh, man, I miss home. I miss Grand Rapids, so on and so forth, and just wasted. And I'm 95% sure it was someone from Behemoth, like not in makeup, but just the long European face, or someone from Lordy, one or the other. We were talking about Grand Rapids beer, Founders beer, so on and so forth, bells and all that shit. And this dude stops making out with this girl under one of these tents and just goes, American beer. You can drink your own urine and it would taste like your beer. European beer is the best. And then just went to keep making out
on this podcast.
Just went to keep making out with this chick, and I was like, okay. I was like, that's a thing this guy said. And then I was like, and the fact that he stopped making out with a girl and tell me that American beer tastes like urine, is pretty interesting. It's something I've never forgotten. That Ozfest, though, like, it was just so sweet. I mean, Dez and I ending up on their bus drinking Dez's wine, which I don't think he does anymore since he's sober now and a vegan. And that was where I was going with this, is that Dez was like, oh, do you like wine? And I was like, I'm more of a red kind of guy. And he goes, oh, well, we just have this new red, so on and so forth. And I remember us drinking wine, and then, like, when we got off their bus, after talking about red wine and, you know, I'm more into port and shit, and just talking about wine and stuff, and being like, I remember at one point I was just like, I'm talking to Dez from Cold Chamber about port wine, red wine in general. Like, what the fuck is my life right now? And then I got
fucking
off the
awesome.
bus, and then I remember getting off the bus, and there was a kid I went to high school with that was like 2 years below me, and he was like, oh my god, Dez, oh, Cold Chamber, oh, Double Driver, I love you, oh, it was like all excited, and he was like, oh my god, Doug, what's up? My nickname, because I look like Doug from
The TV show.
Doug Funny?
I used to have a flat top. It's mainly the nose. I know that. But it was one of those things, like, Dez looked at me and he's like, do you know this guy? And I was like, no. And I pushed the guy aside. And I pulled a dick move, but I almost brought that up yesterday to be like, Dez, do you remember this time you and I had some of your wine on the bus of Ozfest? But I was like, you're sober now, and that'd kind of be a dick move to be like, you remember when you had a wine company? And actually, and I will say this, it was a really good wine. If you're into wine, it was pretty good stuff.
So, Dan,
Yeah.
tell me about As I Lay Dying.
Tell me about Zao and how you really feel about them.
Oh my god, dude.
Oh, are you ready to stay here for like the next 48 hours?
Here's the thing. I could talk about Zao for about 10 hours. But for your guys'
that's a conservative
sake,
number.
I'm going to try to do it in 9.
If we can do it over some eggs over my hammy, I'll be happy.
Oh
with
fuck
that.
yeah, dude! Denny's, you and me, we'll go. It'd be great.
They now deliver it to your house, so we can have a candlelight Denny's meal. How disgusting is that, by the way?
I don't care. I mean, I'm so overweight at this point. I'm like, honestly, it's not gonna be that long before you guys get like see like something on Facebook that's like, loving father died of congestive heart failure. I mean, it's.
Well, hey, it was his week. It was his weekend with his kids.
Right,
and that's the only amount of money after child support he could afford to pay for.
Oh my god, dude! I took
those Denny's cheese sticks are amazing.
Shit, I took my kids to Qdoba today.
I'm sorry, you gotta edit this.
Oh my god, I took my kids to Qdoba today, and like they didn't.
Every direction.
They didn't eat. They didn't eat like barely any of their nachos.
Everywhere.
So like I ate a Qdoba burrito. And
Wait,
then,
hold on.
And then they didn't finish.
Hold on. You go to Qdoba and get burritos? Fuck that. They don't know how to do that. Get a bowl. Get a bowl with some chips.
Fuck you. Okay.
Fuck you. You're not getting enough bang for your buck.
The fucking. I don't give a shit about that. So
Money?
I got a burrito. I ate the whole thing
better on where you are.
in 3 minutes and 48 seconds. And my kids were like, yeah, we like these nachos. They're pretty cool. But they're like little girls. So they ate like 4 nachos each. And I was like, fuck. So I was like, do you want daddy to eat your nachos? And they're like, yes. So I not only ate a Qdoba burrito, but I ate my children's nachos on top of that. And I actually considered going back up to the counter and asking if I could get like a bowl of chips and queso. Like, fuck. Anyway.
Hey, don't sell a skinny guy short. Well, I'm not as skinny as I used to be, but I think I could out-eat Dan.
Timestamp this now, Joe.
It doesn't matter anymore.
For posterity? Your posterity?
Fuck, we've been talking for 50 minutes and we haven't even started the fucking episode.
Yeah, we
okay,
kinda
so
sorta
It's
have.
my fault. I'm really sorry.
welcome to Discography Discussion.
I mean, the interesting thing, though, about Toomey and all of our podcasts is, like, you know, Toomey was very defined by the new metal scene. Like, that's obviously his scene. And with him touring with Primer 55, like, he got very immersed in that new metal scene. But what's interesting, you know, with all of us, I think, is that we grew up in the 80s hair metal scene, and there's definitive genres of the heavy metal scene. Like, there was the 80s hair metal scene, there was the new metal scene, then there became metalcore, and metalcore was one of those scenes for me that felt like mine. It was my thing, and it came around in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I really identified with it because of just it feeling underground at the time with so many of the bands I was listening to. And, you know, honestly, Dan, something, you know, between you and I talking so much over the last like 2 weeks about just our influences and so forth in heavy metal, as a Christian, was As I Lay Dying as big in that scene as they seem to be, or did they just kind of use that as more of a launching point, like very much like bands like Norma Jean and, you know, Under Oath and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, they were. Like, As I Lay Dying was like really hot shit in the Christian scene because before we had As I Lay Dying, we had bands like Zao, Living Sacrifice, Ludacris, or Norma Jean, and like they were pushing this metalcore thing really far for what they were doing. And before Norma Jean, there was a band called Training for Utopia that was really big. And
where were they from?
They were from, I believe, California. And believe it or not, the guys from Training for Utopia were the guys that went on to become Demon Hunter. And what was interesting is that they were like a chaotic metalcore band in Training for Utopia. And so there was a lot, like, there was this whole spirit-filled Christian hardcore movement from the mid to late 90s with, like, bands like Focused and Unashamed and Overcome and all that. And, like, so all of that kind of culminated in metalcore is kind of unique in the sense that, like, how much Christian music actually affected that genre. Yeah, because we used to joke that like 70% of the metalcore bands you hear are Christian, you know.
Yeah.
And
Well, out of curiosity, I mean, since you seem to be more of more knowledgeable on this than I am, because like my wife and I, upon getting together and realizing we have a lot of bands and touring history of going to see a lot of the same shows, you know, Christian metalcore was a really big thing in the early to mid, 2000s.
Yeah.
I know, when we're getting out of high school and so forth. Were labels like, were people into labels like Solid State and Tooth and Nail as much as like people a little bit beyond me, maybe some like you guys who were big into like Roadrunner bands because they were on Roadrunner, and people were more fascinated with bands on a label because they knew it was going to be quality product? Were you finding that?
Yes.
With, Tooth and Nail and Solid State?
Yes, absolutely. And like Tooth and Nail and Solid State were Christian hardcore for the longest time. I mean, you had bands on Tooth and Nail that weren't necessarily Christian, like Frodis and like stuff like that, but like for the most part, it was Christian metal and Christian hardcore bands. And even a band like Frodis is, even if they don't want to admit it, they probably got popular with a lot of Christians because they were on Tooth and Nail. And like that was the whole thing. I don't think that the spirit-filled hardcore movement was like as big as I feel like it was, because I was like really into that at that time. But like, yeah, it was definitely all about Solid State for the longest time. Like, who's the newest Solid State band, and then Face Down Records came by later, and they did kind of the same thing, and it was more of like a tough guy hardcore kind of label, but like they expanded out obviously to include bands like Symphony in Peril and Sinai Beach and bands like that, and like. So, yeah, I think for a long time it was really kind of a big deal in the Christian scene, like, because we had all these great bands that nobody had ever heard of, Like, we had Zao, we had Living Sacrifice, we had bands that were actually, like, could go toe-to-toe with their secular counterparts, And so when As I Lay Dying came out, they were kind of the same sort of thing. They were like, okay, they're taking the best aspects of Zao, and then like, dude, when Frail Words Collapse came out, it was like a revelation to a lot of us, because it was like because I think around that time, I think it was like 2 years later after Frail Words came out, that Living Sacrifice went on this like hiatus, and they disappeared for like 5 years. And so bands like As I Lay Dying were kind of like considered the torchbearers of that scene, and that they were playing like hardcore metalcore kind of stuff, but they were like they were doing it on like a metal level. And like what was weird about As I Lay Dying was that they weren't on Tooth and Nail or Solid State. They weren't on Face Down Records
or Bridge 9.
Right, they were this new band that was playing metalcore, and they were Christian. They were very Christian Christian starting out, and like they were a really huge deal, because we noticed that when Frail Words Collapse came out, that it was like a really popular record, and like people that weren't Christians were getting into it. And that was one of the very first times that we saw that, like in the Christian metalcore hardcore scene, because a lot of people would be like, listen to a band like Focused or Unashamed, and their Christian message was just so strong and so out in front that like it turned people off. But As I Lay Dying was a band that still had the Christian message, still had the Christian leanings, but for some reason nobody gave a shit. Like, they were okay with it. Like, the general masses were totally fine with Frail Words Collapse, because it's not shoving Jesus down your throat. It's not, like, hey, we want you guys to conform to this sort of thing. It was more of like okay, so there's this band, they play awesome metal, but their lead singer is a Christian, and he's had a lot of like spiritual things go on, but it was like really relatable to the average person without it being like this weird contrived, like, because I think with Christian music before that, it was kind of like,
it was preachy.
You kind of had to drink the Kool-Aid to an extent to get behind every song, whereas with As I Lay Dying, it wasn't that way.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on it. They were a Christian band. They were a band that happened to have Christians in it. I think is probably the best way to put it. I don't think they really projected themselves as, hey, come to our show so we can preach to you, because that's actually what, a lot of that other stuff was, you felt like, well, at least I did, because I'm more of a Gothenburg guy, so for me it was hard to relate to. With these guys, it was pretty easy, because it was like, yeah, so what, they're Christians, but they're more about making metal than they are about trying to convert me. That's how I felt about them initially, was like, all right, these guys are cool, because they're not making the fact the Christianity is not the focal point. They just happen to be Christians making good music. And for me, that was appealing, because I was just like, they're just dudes. And for me, that was more important. And I think they did a really good job of actually being at the forefront of the commercialization of metalcore. I think they pushed it longer and harder than anybody else did, even whenever you consider Killswitch in there. I still think As I Lay Dying was the torchbearer for longer than anybody else was, as far as the commercialization of metalcore, and they pushed longer and harder than anybody else did. But that's just my personal opinion. I could be wrong.
Part of the thing about having, and the thing I love about your guys' podcast, and I think that most people love about the podcast as a whole, is feeling like they're a part of a conversation to have with everyone's friends. Like we would all have this conversation if the microphones were not on. Like, I have these conversations with my friends, like, I love this record, I love this band, I love these things about these people. So something I told Daniel in leading up to this conversation, because basically I kind of picked this narrative of As I Lay Dying being our discography discussion. So something I researched was the Faulkner book that the band grabbed their name from. The quote specifically that the band grabbed their name from, the line is, "As I lay dying, the woman with the dog's eyes would not close my eyes as I descended into Hades." So very Christian undertones, very obviously a part of that. Interestingly enough, the book has been, it was written in the 1930s and has kind of been described as like a gothic, book. Interestingly enough, the band has been described as taking influences from the Gothenburg style and leanings. So it's interesting, like, although the band has always said, like, there's nothing about the book that we identify with, it has nothing to do with our band or anything, but it's weird to look back now all these years later and be like, the book was a gothic leaning style of writing, the band kind of took a Gothenburg thing from the European metal scene. And what's interesting about Frail Words Collapse, at least, we already had kind of talked about the EP. And the EP basically became half of what became Frail Words Collapse. And I think that was a very common thing. Like, you look at Atreyu, you look at the album, the EP Visions or whatever, half of Visions became what became Suicide Notes and Butterfly Effects. I think that was kind of the theme and the groundwork for a lot of the metalcore scene, is like there would be an EP that no one heard of, and half of the EP would then be re-released in the best versions of the songs from those EPs, would make the final cut as the half of the new record, which would become their first full length. And what's interesting, though, is, to me, like, there's some stuff about Frail Words Collapse that I don't know if anyone's really talked about, but, like, something that, in doing research for this discussion, that I didn't know about until I really took the deep dive. Did any of you know that Jacob Bandon from Converge did the album artwork for, like, the first couple records?
I actually did know that.
You fucking nerd.
It's very obvious. No, but it's very obvious that it's him.
Well, I mean, that was the thing, is like, because coincidentally, as I got the vinyl of the first couple of records on, in the mail recently, I kept looking at it, I was like, man, this shit's so, like, it's so specific, like the style, like everything about it, it's very unique unto itself, but it seems very similar. And then when I kind of did my dive on the band, and I saw that Jacob Bandon and Converge did it, and I was like, oh, fuck, it makes so much sense now. Like this band was really set up for success, because, I mean, what band can you really think of that was, like, on their real first major label, debut, and granted, Converge isn't at the level that they are now back then, but, I mean, Jacob Bandon's doing production, and interestingly enough, on the first handful of records, the band was producing their own shit. Like, that's interesting to me. Like, I don't know if it is to you. Like, I don't know how into production any of you guys get, but the fact that, one of the things to me is, like, how this record, Frail Words Collapse sounds, I think, is just in how raw it is, and the fact that Tim and Evan, their guitar player at the time, produced this record. And the fact that a guitar player and a vocalist were able to make a record that sounds really good unilaterally across the board, like where nothing is fighting for space, really is interesting to me.
Well, the drums really like dominate the production on that record.
And oddly, the drummer had nothing to do with it.
It was a huge deal though, because I remember like that double bass segment in 94 Hours.
Oh yeah,
was like the talk of the town.
Yes.
Forever. Even though it's funny because I listen to it now and I'm like, I don't know if that was real or if that was monetized. But the weird thing about it is that like I remember being this huge deal to people because like at this time, metalcore was basically new metal. Like there were bands like Killswitch Engage that like kind of bridge the gap in the sense of like we're playing metalcore but we have all this melodic singing, so people that are into like Mudvayne and stuff like that are probably going to appreciate this.
But you're sorry to cut you off. You're talking about because we've referenced Killswitch a couple of times now. Killswitch and bands like Unearth, Killswitch, God forbid. There's so much of that New England Darkest Hour. There's so much of that New England Shadows Fall. There's so much of that New England metal, what would become metalcore, but it was the New England wave of like heavy metal that put its stamp on everything. And it's like As Lay Dying were like on the other coast. They're on the West Coast dealing with this shit and not sounding like anybody else is coming out at that time. It's such a weird anomaly to think about that. Like with you're saying, like with bands like Killswitch, Unearth, like all the bands from the New England side of things, which eventually, spoiler alert, Adam D would produce a bunch of As Lay Dying records. It's just weird to see how much attention As Lay Dying was getting so early on for what they were doing, considering they weren't a part of the scene that was setting the metalcore scene on fire at the time.
Well, yeah, and what I can't figure out is how they got as popular as they did, being as extreme as they were.
Do you think it was touring, honestly? I mean, because touring it still is a big thing. The bands they were touring with at the time, I think, were like bands, honestly, like bands like Killswitch, Himza, which was I can't believe, in side changing, I can't believe Himza has never gotten the just due that they honestly deserve for bridging European and American metal together. Like they were so far ahead of their time and they just never got the credit they deserved.
Well, I think what it was is that like, I think by 2003, everybody was tired of new metal.
Yeah,
I think that had been played out. And especially living in a town like St. Louis, which I've said, like historically is like 15 years behind the time. I mean, like our local new rock alternative station plays shit like
Breaking Benjamin.
All the fucking time.
Or like even stuff like Stone Temple Pilots and stuff like it's still relevant.
I think that's what alternative radio as a whole has become now, though.
Right, it's all butt rock, basically. And, like, the thing is that, like, I don't mind those old bands, because they were doing something original at the time, too, like As Lay Dying was doing in 2003. But, like, I think it was just interesting that people were tired of new metal. They wanted something heavier. They wanted something that was more metal. That was a little bit less like backwards baseball cap and rappy and like faux tough guy, because that's one thing that I revisit a lot on this podcast is the whole idea of like tough guy metal.
Okay.
And like As Lay Dying was not that. They were aggressive, they were ball busting, they were fucking heavy, but the thing about them was that they weren't like using that heaviness as like I'm gonna beat your ass, your girlfriend wants to fuck me, she doesn't want to fuck you, like that sort of stuff. And like that really spoke to me, especially being like a Christian metalcore fan at the time. I wasn't into bands that were like that, and to a certain extent I'm still not, but like that whole like faux misogynistic tough guy stuff, As Lay Dying didn't have that, so I think that's why they spoke to as many people as they did, in that like, hey, you can be really aggressive, but the aggressiveness is about your emotions. It's about what you're actually feeling. And I feel like Frail Words Collapse is that 100%, because it's a very melodic record. It hits you in the feels in places. I mean, like that singing part in Distance is Darkness.
By the way, a friend of mine and I, like one of my best friends, him and I have this thing for and it was a thing of that time frame that I don't know if there's things that As I Lay Dying as a whole has done over their whole career that are very in the moment of their career, of the time that the album is coming out. And so The Distance is Darkness, there's a part in that song where around that time in the early like 2003, 2004, a lot of bands were doing that thing where it was a raw vocal and you would hear the thing before a song would cut into whatever. Yeah. And like that was always something on that record that like we're always like, this is like so raw, so real, so emotional. And it's like that was a stamp of the time because so many bands of that genre were doing that like where most people would probably edit out the breath in, the deep breathe in before the scream or whatever's coming. They left that in, and there were a lot of bands of that time frame that did that. And I feel like As I Lay Dying, for better or worse, has always kind of had their finger on the pulse of whatever studio tricks, things of the bands of their time frame, the things that they do. I feel like they've always done really well with kind of having something that stamps the time frame of when those records came out. I mean, do you agree with me on that or no?
Yeah, no, I definitely heard that, and that's what I liked about the record. Because, like, even back then, I was still a little bit more of an elitist in the sense of, like, I want stuff that's real, I want stuff that's raw, I want stuff that's emotional. Like, I wasn't thrilled that Forever had singing in it, because at that time, 1998 through 2003, singing was not welcome in metalcore.
I think going back as far as why they're popular, or why
as a whole, or from that at that time.
No, at that time,
especially in the Christian scene.
Yeah, no, okay, we were talking about because you were saying how heavy they are and why were they so popular even with as heavy as they are. I think it's a natural progression of the whole aspect of counterculture with pop music. I mean, you had hair metal, and then you had grunge, and then you had nu metal, and I just think it was. Once you split the rap out of the nu metal, you had something that was really heavy, and people still wanted something that was heavy, and I think that's where the mainstream metalcore came in, especially once you got past the point of like what Dan was saying, like from like 97, 2003, like clean singing was not acceptable. As soon as clean singing became acceptable in metalcore, I think that's when it blew up on a global scale. That's whenever you had like you had all these bands, just coming out of nowhere that, if you weren't in this, if you didn't have your finger on the pulse of the scene, you're like, well, where'd all these heavy bands come from? Where's As I Lay Dying and, Atreyu and Killswitch Engage and Bullet for My Valentine, all this stuff all of a sudden just boom, here it is. And I think it's because some producer somewhere was super fucking smart and or just knew what was coming and was able to bridge that gap and bring the counterculture of needing something heavy but still making it radio friendly. I think that's super important, and I think if we go into it further, I mean, I think as soon as Phil was in the band, that's when they really exploded. I think Phil was way more important than people realize to making that band popular. His clean singing is exactly what radio-friendly people are looking for. Now, whether we like it or not, that's a different argument. But for radio friendly, Phil's clean vocals were super important, I think, on making, tons of teenagers in early 20s buy their records.
So two things on that, and I think Dan's about ready to correct you on that as well. Two things on that. I wonder how much of Headbangers Ball 2 or Headbangers Ball the second incarnation had a big impact on what would become, the metalcore scene between your bands like Atreyu, your As I Lay Dyings, and so forth. How much that would end up having to be an extra platform for the mainstream getting into this thing. Secondly, to your point of Phil's clean vocals, Something I kind of wanted.
Them.
Yeah, he didn't do them. Definitely.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So actually, I have a note here that Dave Arthur of Kings to You, I believe is the band, did the vocals for Shadows of Security because the bass player at the time, which was Clint Norris, didn't have, and again, for people who won't see this, quote unquote, powerful enough vocals, according to Tim and the rest of the band. Excuse me, the rest of the band. So at that point, there was. I definitely agree with you. I think the addition of Nick and Phil Segroso and Nick Hippa, the guitar players, just really cemented what Jordan was doing on drum. Jordan is one of the best drummers of the fucking metalcore scene, just in general, of the scene as a whole. And the fact that when they added Nick and Phil, I think because they added them toward the very end of the touring cycle of Frail Words Collapse. And I remember reading a Guitar World interview with Nick, and he was saying that I remember going into, before they started recording what would become Shadows of Security, he was like, I remember playing songs off of Frail Words Collapse and thinking like, oh my god, these are the most insane songs I've ever had to learn how to play. Like, the parts of them are so crazy. But honestly, you listen to Frail Words Collapse to Shadows of Security and you're like, holy shit, this band just went from like here to like the next fucking level. And I gotta say, it's like, you know, like I just made mention, Jordan was a phenomenal drummer, and anyone who listens to Frail Words Collapse has to admit that their drumming on is phenomenal. And it isn't until you get to a song like Elegy where I feel like you see the band going where they potentially could and where they do go as far as the different production tricks and some of the stuff that they do with the songwriting. But man, I remember getting Shadows of Security and hearing the opening two tracks. I can't remember the first track by name, but I know Confined is the second track. And it's like you just hear that riff. And I just remember the video, like all the rain pouring down on these, like, in no homo, old like fucking hashtag before hashtags were invented. No homo, but like dudes in tight black t-shirts in the rain just fucking shredding and like beating shit. And I remember just being like, this is as like dying how they should be. The band as it stands on Shadows of Security are what's going to take this band to that next level. And I'll be, no pun intended, I'll be goddamned if that band didn't reach that next level on the strength of how the musicianship of Shadows of Security was.
I'll be the first to admit I'm definitely a neophyte when it comes to like knowing band members and who does what when it comes to As I Lay Dying. Who did the clean vocals on An Ocean Between Us?
Ocean Between Us, actually, that's a fun fact too. So the first song that had clean vocals, Tim actually did the pre-production version of the clean vocals, and then everyone liked how it sounded, so they kept them. So for the first time on recorded stuff, Tim did clean vocals, semi-clean vocals on An Ocean Between Us. But basically, that was where they had ended up getting Josh, the bass player, who would end up being on the bass, playing bass for them throughout the rest of the tenure of the band. He did clean vocals from there on out. Shadows of Security.
So it was Josh that did everything.
From there on.
Okay, yeah,
from there on out.
That's my fault for saying earlier that it was Phil, and I guess I should have said Josh.
He does do backing vocals though, to be fair.
Okay, but that album, I think that's like that album is like the standard bearer for like commercialized metalcore. That is exactly what they were looking for radio play, I guess is what I was trying to get at earlier. I just accredited the incorrect person.
No, I mean, but that's the thing, though, is I think a lot of people don't realize because they got the bass player Clint Norris, who had like sleeves and was like super skinny and had like the long hair and was very much of the metalcore look to the band, especially on that record. He was projected as doing all of the clean vocals on Shadows of Security. And if you end up watching the documentary, This Is Who We Are, they end up talking about how Clint wasn't able to produce powerful enough vocals for the choruses of what they were looking for. So as a result, like I said, they ended up getting Dave Arthur of Kings to You to do the vocals because they were the vocals that they needed. So basically, if you ever saw As Lay Dying on the Shadows of Security record, which, I mean, they toured with amazing bands like Killswitch Engage and Soilwork was one of the tours that came around here in Michigan. I mean, basically speaking to either end of their influences. But it's one of those things that, like, if you saw them live with Clint, you were just like, these don't sound quite like the record. And it took a little bit of research. I mean, the internet being what it is now was not what it was back then. So, I mean, the fact that you found out that Clint wasn't the one singing on the record wasn't as easily accessible as it is now to find out. But no, I totally agree with you. Like, the strong hooks and choruses of Shadows of Our Security is one of the things that I think leads that to being one of the more definitive records of the metalcore sound at the time. Because before we get, no spoiler alert, but by the time we get to An Ocean Between Us, like, holy fuck, like, that band is hitting on all cylinders. But yeah, I think the fact that you're seeing what Nick Hippa and Phil Segroso as the guitar players, the two guitar players, and Jordan's drumming ability, I think you're just seeing this band starting to reach its full potential. And that's what's amazing to look back on now is, like, I remember listening to this record when it first came out and just being like, this is leaps and bounds above what Frail Words Collapse is. And the crazy thing is like, it was still self-produced basically, just like Frail Words Collapse was. And just hear just a sonic difference in the two records with the new members, you're just like, man, if you weren't a fan of Frail Words Collapse and you listen to Shadows of Security and you're not, like, on board, like, I don't know what the fuck you're into as far as metalcore, because, like, that is, like, one of the definitive, like, the turning point kind of metalcore and what it can be and what it should be. I don't know if any of you agree with that at all.
I'm agreeing with you. I think Dan might have a different perspective.
I'm going to jump in here.
Yeah, I knew he would, because
Jeff, Dan's going to jump in.
So not to be as what Joe would describe it as, all Dan Terry about it, but Shadows of Security was a little bit of a disappointment for me.
Okay, can I ask you why?
Yes, you can. So Shadows of Security was kind of, so Frail Words was huge. I love Frail Words.
For you, or because here's something
everyone,
I've learned.
it was a revolution.
You all have been doing podcasts long enough now and talked about a lot of different bands' discographies, and I've talked to different people about specific albums and their discographies. Are you able to look at it as just a fan and talking about you as a fan, or are you looking at it now as someone who's kind of talked to people about this genre and this time frame, and you're looking at it from that perspective?
Well, I think for me it's a little bit of both, because I'll give both perspectives on it.
Okay.
So what I'm talking about right now is how I felt when this record came out.
Okay.
So at the time, I was still very into Christian metalcore.
Okay.
That was my thing, which is funny because at this time, if you were into Christian metalcore, you were into metalcore. Overall, whether it be Christian or not. And I remember at that time, I had started to move a little bit less towards metalcore and a little bit more into death metal. Like, don't get me wrong, metalcore was my start for checking out more extreme bands. So, like, for me as a fan, I was starting to check out stuff that was, like, a little bit more extreme than As I Lay Dying. And so Christian metalcore as a genre had exploded by that time. We had bands like Nodes of Ranvier. We had bands like Symphony in Peril. We had all these newer bands that had popped up. And, Zayo was still doing their thing, albeit it was weird. But they were at that time. And so it was
Position,
one of those...
heal thyself.
It was one of those weird moments in history where it was like I had gotten really into Gothenburg death metal at the time. I was a huge fan of bands like At the Gates.
Totally.
And bands like In Flames.
Dark Tranquility.
So then I started
hearing... Hold on. Hold on. Just to cut you off right there. Something I've always wanted to talk about. with you two mentioning those two bands, you are aware that those two bands singers used to, because they came from. You're very aware that they
Go
used to
listen
still
to our
write
In
for each
Flames
other.
episode, John.
Yeah, we have we went ape shit on that episode.
Well, I mean, it's interesting to
I did
find
too,
though
not
that
as much
a
as
lot
you.
of people don't know that Anders and the singer from Dark Tranquility wrote with each other for each other's albums. Like,
yes.
I mean, Fiction by Dark Tranquility is still one of my favorite fucking records, like, of that time period. It's still so fucking good.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, go ahead, continue.
So I was really into bands like that.
Okay.
And that's whenever I started realizing that a lot of the metalcore bands that I was into at the time were more or less ripping off or directly borrowing from, because I was like really into Unearthed for a while. And
underrated band.
They are underrated, but at that time, Unearthed is a band that got better over time.
Totally.
Whereas in their early form,
talking like the Oncoming Storm or and prior?
Yeah,
okay.
Oncoming Storm specifically.
Okay.
And so when I heard Shadows of Security, I heard a little bit of what As I Lay Dying had established on Fair Words Collapse. I still was into the record. I mean, you can't listen to a song like Confined and be like, this is bullshit. And like nobody thought that, you know? So like, I mean, there are definitely songs I like about it. Control Denied, I believe Dan from Zayo was on that song. Go back and listen to it. Dan from Zayo was on Shadows of Security. Which, I mean, for me, that's a fucking trump card, you know, like that.
I mean, the only song I can honestly think of that Dan's been on, and because of my lack of knowledge on Zayo, is the Last Still Remains record.
It's okay, buddy. We'll talk. But basically, with Dan from Zayo, I mean, obviously being a phenomenal vocalist. But the problem I had with Shadows is that I kind of felt like a lot of the songs ran together. You have a very consistent sound. Yes. It is more technical than Frail Words. You know,
Evan left the band.
Yeah, from a purely musician standpoint, it is superior. However, it isn't necessarily more interesting to my ears. And like Confined was great, Darkest Nights was great. Morning Waits is one of my favorite As I Lay Dying songs, like bar none. Love it. However, I kind of felt like at that time, looking at the context of what I was into, it kind of seemed a little bit trite, in my opinion. Now, in 2018, I had to go back and listen to all these records again. Like, really listen to them. And yes, I found Shadows of Security to be much more musical, like musically sound, than what we had on Frail Words. Frail Words had a lot of like old school metalcore shit in there.
It had a lot of parts. It was a lot of parts put together.
It wasn't necessarily songs, whereas like with Shadows, they kind of like wrote better songs. But at the same time, I'm hearing riffs that I've heard on In Flames records. I'm hearing parts. And so like at the time, being kind of more of an asshole, whereas I mean, I'm still an asshole for sure, but like it's one of those things where it really was kind of a darker spot for me because I had already been introduced to As I Lay Dying. If you had listened to the band only on Shadows on, you'd be like, this is the greatest fucking thing I've heard in my life. But I hadn't. I had been listening ever since Encasing of Ashes. So, like, I saw the band change. And then whenever we got to Shadows of Security, it was like, oh, fuck, it's Gothenburg riffs with metalcore breakdowns and a screaming vocalist. And it was just one of those, like, it's cool, but it's kind of pedestrian in the sense of, like, if you're somebody that is just jumping ship from nu metal to metalcore, I could understand how you love this record. But as a fan of the band from as early on as I was kind of like, this is okay, but it's not amazing. And, you know, like, yeah, okay, there were guitar solos on Shadows of Security, but there weren't on Frail Words Collapse. But, like, as a metalcore fan, I wasn't, like, as into guitar solos, you know? Like, I wasn't into all that noodly shit. So I kind of found it to be a little bit, like I said, like a little bit more trite. But listening to it now, I'm like, holy fuck! Like, I skipped way less songs on Shadows of Security than I did on Frail Words when I was doing my re-listen. So that just shows you the growth, like, from me over the past 13 years or 14 years. Like, it's definitely a better record, and I can appreciate that as a music critic now versus being just a fanboy back in the day.
Something for me as a fan of the band, as a fan of someone who latches on to production tricks and so forth, even though I don't know production at all, one of the songs that, like, I think really exemplifies the growth of the band and kind of something they ended up doing over the course of their career, a song like Reflection. It's fucking disgustingly heavy. But then they have that pan breakdown where it's like in your like left ear when you're listening to headphones, or if you have a really good sound system, pan breakdown like left to right, then a bass drop, and then during when everyone comes back in, there's a fucking bass drop. So when you hear it in headphones, it's like you hear that, and then like I think by the fourth measure of the same breakdown riff, another bass drop hits, like. There's shit like that where it's like there wasn't anything like that on Frail Words Collapse or anything like that. Like where it's like they're very, and again, like something that I constantly bring up in talking about albums on my podcast is as much as I love production, I don't know shit about production logistically. But I mean, like that pan breakdown, like that just is something that was sort of its time. Like I can think of like some Unearthed riffs and some other stuff where it's like if you have a good pair of headphones, like there'd be pan breakdowns. Like there is a band here locally, the band The Orphan, and they had a pan breakdown, and they were like, oh, it was totally inspired by Shadows of Security. So I mean, I think that kind of speaks to the relevance of Shadows of Security on the metalcore scene. That we brought up bands like Unearthed, and we talked about the Gothenburg sound of bands like At the Gates and In Flames and so forth. And I mean, even further to the point of like, In Flames being ripped off. Everyone's probably have seen that YouTube video of a Troy Ewan Unearthed of Right Side of the Bed. And I can't remember the In Flames song, but I know it definitely was very borrowed.
It was The Hive off of Horacle.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. But I mean, like, so
if you didn't say it, I was going to say it.
Okay. But I was going to say, like, there's obviously like bands of this time frame that ripped off In Flames hardcore. No pun intended on either realm. But I mean, it's one of those things where Shadows of Security, I think it really is a benchmark album of the scene. And I don't know that a lot of people feel that way about it.
I'm going to agree with you. I think it's I don't think it's their best work.
No, it definitely is not their best work, but it is a benchmark of the scene.
Right. It was a
production.
It was a turning of the corner. Like the first song I heard off this album was Confined.
Oh, disgustingly heavy.
And I was like, holy shit. Like, this is what I want. I like it. It's tight. It's clean. It's heavy as hell.
Can we ask the producer of this podcast how he feels about the production of this album?
So here's the thing about metalcore.
Okay.
The bass drum is triggered. I got that out of the way.
For sure.
We're moving on from the triggered bass drum. Yes, everybody ripped off In Flames.
Mm-hmm.
But there became a point where As I Lay Dying took the trophy home, and they were the standard bearers of this type of metalcore.
Yes.
Everybody ripped off As I Lay Dying. However we got to where we were on this record, this is now the band that everybody ripped off. For guitar players, everybody knows the As I Lay Dying riff. The 875-3578 pull-off riff.
We did it.
Everybody knows it.
On our album, we did it.
The other side of that coin, we've talked about before. There was a point where everybody ripped off Hope's Fall. But then they started ripping off Under Oath. After Under Oath ripped off Hope's Fall. So there's the Hope's Fall interval of the open 8, 10, 7. Everybody knows that. And
I'm sorry, I'm going to give credit to Jamie Josta. He calls that the area code riff.
Yep.
I'm just saying 616, 8110.
That's
like I
right.
can go like sometimes when I get stagnant on like some breakdown riffs or whatever, some grooves, like I'll remember like Jost always talks about area code riffs, and I'll start busting out some area code riffs, and I'll be goddamned, again pun intended on this podcast, I'll be goddamned if sometimes those area code riffs don't like give you some inspiration to write some new shit.
And everybody did it. So
Totally.
I feel about it, it was good for what it was. It changed what was popular. And I still ask myself, how did this type of metal become popular? And the answer
What is your answer? What is your answer?
My answer is it wasn't what was popular before. It wasn't shitty pop music with auto-tune. It wasn't nu metal. It wasn't rap. It was metal being played by people that listened to underground bands who said, how do we make this poppy? And like all strange pop trends, it was an accident. Nobody told me in 1999 that in 3 years, pop music would be heavy metal with hardcore vocals.
How do the other two of you feel about that?
You want to take this first, Jeff, or you want me to take it?
Do you agree? Do you agree with that sentiment?
I didn't appreciate it being poppy. I think that was my thing.
What do you mean by being poppy? You didn't appreciate the poppiness coming into your metal, or
Yes, I didn't appreciate the poppiness coming into my metal. And again, that's just an asshole statement, but here we are. So
no, I think it's totally legit.
it was one of those, like, because even whenever we were talking about Fair Words Collapse and I was talking about Forever, I didn't necessarily appreciate having those melodic choruses. So songs, I didn't appreciate songs having choruses.
Why? Can I ask why?
This is because it's just not something that I'm necessarily into. Like, there's no denying a good chorus. Like I said, there's a huge difference between me in 2018 versus me in 2004.
You're not an elitist anymore.
I'm not as much of an elitist.
Well, I was gonna say, but like you still seem to identify with those feelings. So do you still feel that way?
Not necessarily. Like I said, I'm much more open to a poppy chorus. I'm much more open to a listenable. On our last podcast that probably just posted last week, I was talking about we were doing album of the week because we do that at the end of the podcast. So get ready for that. Think of whatever you've been listening to this week. But the thing is that we were talking about our album of the week, and I said that my album of the week was The End of All Things to Come from Mudvayne.
I love that record.
Which is so funny because back in 2004, I would have
loved it.
I would have punched you in the dick for even suggesting that I listen to Mudvayne.
And I would have punched you in the dick and told you, "Fuck you! You need to listen to the song structures, the lyrics, the production,
yes.
everything.
Yes.
Everything about that record is amazing."
What I said about that record was that yes, it is a more poppy Mudvayne. It is a little bit more media accessible Mudvayne. Okay, LD50 is an amazingly technical record, but you have to be a certain type of person to appreciate it.
Me.
Okay, you have to be a certain type of person to appreciate it.
I mean, I love that record.
So like Dig?
To me, go ahead.
Dig, you already have to be a fan of heavy music to appreciate something like Dig.
I disagree.
I don't think you do.
No, you do. You do.
I totally disagree.
Well, you guys can.
I don't think you do.
Basically, what I'm saying is that, like, these are, like, Dig was the type of song, or even Death Blooms or songs like that were a little bit more like you had to at least be into nu metal.
But you're
to like those
the thing
bands.
is though is you're referencing the two singles. Like you're not even going deep tracks like where you're talking about.
No, because the
Nothing
average
to
radio
Gain and
listener,
stuff like that.
the
Like,
average radio listener has only heard Dig and has only heard Death Blooms.
Okay.
That's what I'm trying to say. Okay, yeah, songs like Pharmacopoeia are fucking amazing. You know, don't get me wrong. I love the deep cuts on LD50. I love LD50. The thing is, though, what I said is that you have to be a certain kind of person to like something like Dig. You have to at least be a fan of nu metal. If you're listening to something like Dig and liking it, you're probably a fan of Slipknot already. You're probably a fan of Korn. You're probably a fan of like those more down-tuned nu metal bands. I don't think I'm completely wrong for saying that.
No.
Okay, because I remember when it came out. I remember the time period.
Yeah, see,
my way was the alternative Slipknot, if you remember.
That's fine. But what I'm
that was
saying,
how it was presented.
But what I'm trying to say
It's true.
that a song like Not Falling.
Well, no, hold on. Now you're like 3 albums down.
No,
at
I'm
this
not.
point.
No, Not Falling came out directly after LD50.
No, not fall. I'm sorry, you are right. They came out on the End of All Things to Come.
Yes.
But they released that single twice, if you remember correctly.
Right, I get that. But what I'm saying is that, like, to listen to a song like Not Falling doesn't necessarily require you to be a certain type of person. It doesn't
I think it
necessarily
definitely needs you to listen to a song like Death Blooms to understand the weird intricacies of that band and how they are
Right.
poppy but not.
Right, but what I'm catching you in is that you say you have to appreciate the weird stuff, the weird intricacies.
See, the weird
But
stuff.
you don't necessarily have to know that to get
like you
into
do.
to get into Not Falling. Not Falling has a really catchy chorus. It has a really catchy. It's got really catchy verses.
Overall melody.
Overall melody. It is a little bit less technical, a little bit less heavy Mudvayne. And again, you guys are defending it like I'm saying that that's a bad thing, because I'm not.
No, actually, I would actually almost say it's more technical in the fact that it has to appeal to a more wider array of audience.
It is. It is more technical. But what I'm saying is that, like, you don't have to know it's more technical to enjoy that song over something like a Dig.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. And if you're the kind of person that doesn't like screaming vocals, because that is still, I hate to say it, the deciding factor between a lot of people and heavy music. A lot of people want to like heavy bands, but they don't appreciate the growled, animalistic vocal that's associated with it.
Yeah, that's why
So
there's
a
this thing
song
called
like Not
power
Falling
metal.
is infinitely more appealing than a Dig. Am I wrong? Am I wrong? Like, universally unappealing. Yes, for the four of us, it's not a big deal. We listen to heavy shit all the time. It makes sense.
But I didn't back then.
Right, if you didn't back then. So what I was trying to say is that record is a better record to me because of its universal appeal. To get back to my original point, I liked it because it was more listenable, more immediately listenable for the average person than LD50 would have been.
You're absolutely correct, and it's for one very mainstream reason.
Which is?
Mainstream audiences will always gravitate to melodic sung vocals, which LD50 has, but not out in front in a verse, chorus, verse structure.
So
Okay, sorry to cut you collectively everyone off. Something you've actually talked about on this podcast on the Haste the Day episode, and something we can bring back to As Lay Dying that has never happened is the fact that there's never been the album version of something with like Haste the Day with like When Everything Falls, where there was the Jimmy Ryan normal vocals, where it wasn't like the raspy ass Zayo vocals,
Which you got on the album, but not the music video.
No. You got on the music video, not on the album version. You were right, but on the wrong.
Flippy flop.
You flipped it. As Lay Dying never did that thing where you would have a video that would have semi-clean vocals with like very much like a Haste the Day. I mean, Killswitch. Look at the end of Heartache. When they released the Resident Evil version of the song, it had all clean vocals. The bridge was not even in the song. As Lay Dying has never done that. They've been very unapologetically disgustingly heavy, even if maybe at the cost of gaining fans because of not having a song like The Darkest Nights be bringing it back to Shadows of Security, not necessarily having it all be clean song bridges or choruses or whatever. The band was unapologetically heavy. Confined is a disgustingly heavy song, and for that to be the first single off of the album, followed by Darkest Nights, followed by Reflections, it's like the trend of that record is, fuck you, we are a disgustingly heavy metal band with no clean singing. What little bit of clean singing you may find in this band is not how the rest of the album may be.
That might be the answer to my previous question. Why did Haste the Day have to change the vocals for their music video?
Okay.
Nobody likes Zayo vocals.
But a band like Under Oath didn't have to do that, and the answer is somebody literally had to look at it and say, well, this is our audience, and we want to get the other 7 million people, so we're going to do this for the video. Whereas Under Oath was, well, this is our audience. We've already got all the teenage girls and most of the hardcore guys.
My thing is this. I love I love Jimmy Ryan. Actually, him and I have been trying to do a podcast for the longest fucking time because I love a lot of what Jimmy Ryan's done between Haste Today and Trenches, which if you're not familiar with Trenches, go back and listen to that fucking record.
The tide will swallow us fucking whole.
Oh my God. And there's another one apparently coming soon, and I hope it fucking
amazing.
does.
It's amazing. It's a great record.
But here's my thing. When Stephen Keach got into the band, Press of the Hinges, when it fucking happened, my God, did that band turn a corner and was able to reach so many more people because of what Stephen Keach was able to do vocally that Jimmy Ryan could not. And I know Brandon, the guitar player, was able to do clean vocals for Haste Today, and he did on the first 2 records. And there was gang vocals, and there was a Goo Goo Dolls cover and all that shit. But honestly, if you don't listen to Press of the Hinges, very much like listening to As Lay Dying's Shadows of Security, and be able to see the corner that the band has turned, to be able to be like, holy fuck, this band has like turned the fucking corner. This is what the band can and should be. Fuck, I don't know if we can be friends and talk about these bands and these records in this genre, because Haste Today's Pressure the Hinges took that band to another level that just is astronomically it is exactly why that record is exactly why the band was able to go further in their career than they ever would have gone if they kept Jimmy in the band. And I'm sorry, because I mean, like Coward has a great record, but I think a lot of it is due to the fact that the duality of having Jimmy and Steven as co-vocalist and having the band that ended up doing Return of the Wolf King, which I'm sorry is probably one of the best full-on Haste Today records on record because of how dynamic it is and became. And I went and saw the band at the last, quote unquote, the last show with Jimmy, with everybody involved. And then I went and saw the Burning Bridges, which, Daniel, I'm still going to send you that Burning Bridges sign poster from all the original members.
Please do.
I will. For a link to another episode it's to be named later on. It's like draft picks. But no, like for real though, like having been able to see that band and it be a band that's so important to me in my metalcore history, like I mean, Still Remains is from here in Grand Rapids. Like TJ Miller is someone that I know personally. Like I'm not name dropping just a bullshit. Like it's something that is very relevant to what became my introduction to this scene. And it's like Still Remains and Haste Today were big in my Christian metal upbringing, even though I was not a Christian, and I'm still not. But it's one of those things that I feel like if you can't understand what Pressure the Hinges did for Haste Today because of the vocalist change, to comparison to what As Lay Dying did because they were a contemporary and a peer to Haste Today and Still Remains and all those guys, if you can't see what Shadows of Security did for that band, production-wise, songwriting-wise, everything, like I really don't think you understand how big and such a landmark this fucking record really was. Like Phil, Nick, Jordan, Tim, like holy fuck, they just took this band to the next fucking level. And you know what? I'm really ready to talk about An Ocean Between Us, because holy fuck, this is probably my favorite fucking As Lay Dying record.
Before we do that, I want to go back to what my original point was.
Go ahead, please.
My original point was that there was a huge difference between me in 2004, 2005.
Okay.
And me in 2018. The reason I brought the Mudvayne record up was an example of that. Okay. Saying that back when The End of All Things to Come came out, I wasn't into it because it was too poppy and it was not a heavy Mudvayne like the first record was and all that shit. And it's all bullshit. It's the kind of stuff that fanboys say. People that don't know a whole lot about music will say, because you see the really kind of what's the word I'm looking for, Geoff? It's aesthetics. You see the really basic aesthetics where you're like, okay, they sing more on this record and they don't scream as much, so I don't like it as much. You know, and so that's where I probably was back when that record came out. Okay, and like when we're talking about Haste Today, I was not into Pressure the Hinges when it came out. But like when we did our Haste Day episode, did I say anything negative about Pressure the Hinges?
No, but you also were pretty quiet about that record,
Well,
which I think it's very much
Dude,
like
Eye of the
how I
Needle
would.
has
It's
one of
very
the
much like
heaviest
how I
fucking
would
breakdowns
say.
I've ever heard.
I was gonna say it's very much how I feel like sometimes, like, you know, like when you listen to the production side of things, and sometimes it's not what's being played, it's not what's happening, it's not what you're hearing is the most loudest. When I listened back to that Haste the Day thing, and you didn't comment to me, it's to quote a Haste the Day lyric, silence is louder.
Well, no,
it might have been
mean,
that he was too busy drinking beer, though.
I might have
too.
been taking a piss or drinking a beer or something like
No,
that.
okay. No,
The thing is
to be
that
fair,
the thing is that I love the Stephen Keach Haste the Day. I don't
He's
think
so good.
I don't think I
my
made
He
God,
added
yes.
such a dynamic.
I don't
to
think
that.
I
he
made
did.
any bones about that. Like throughout, the thing is that in 2018 I appreciate stuff that's a little bit more listenable and a little bit more like it. But whereas you have to understand, back in 2003, 2004, I was heavily cemented in the Christian hardcore scene. Okay, so that meant that I'm going to not check out a band that's super poppy. It's like, I remember at the time it was very much like, and I wouldn't have said these words because I was in the Christian hardcore scene, but it was like, fuck As I Lay Dying. I'm going to go listen to all these other bands that are more underground and not as popular. However, whenever I went back and listened to Shadows of Security this time, I was like, holy shit. And that's the point I was originally trying to make, because I feel like, John, you're arguing with me in 2003, 2004.
And I'm arguing with you now.
And you're arguing with me now, but the thing is that now I'm not necessarily in disagreement with you about Shadows of Security, but I am trying to provide a context or a point for how people may have felt back when that record first came out, because we've lopped praise on it. Obviously it was a huge record for the band. It had all the right ingredients. It was sonically superior in almost every way than Frail Words Collapse was. Okay, so I'm not denying any of that, and I'm not even backtracking. Like, that's legitimately how I felt whenever I listened to the record. Because you remember when I was on my way down here, what the fuck record did I take a picture of that I was listening to on the way down here?
One.
Shadows of Security.
So can I ask you this? Though? Like, so I mean, something I'm going to get into as we go further. And again, I'm really sorry you're going to have to edit all this into your normal time frame of a podcast. But
it's all right. He'll make me sound good, make you sound bad. It will be perfect.
It'll probably make me sound terrible. But I mean, Shadows of Security, I think from Frail Words Collapse to Shadows of Security, Frail Words Collapse debuted at like, I don't even think it debuted in the top 200 on Billboard. Shadows of Security debuted at 35 on the Billboard Top 200. So, I mean, I think that speaks to the volume of like how big the band had gotten from Frail Words to Shadows of Security. But beyond that, something I want to know, because, I mean, you're talking about your knowledge of the Christian underground metalcore scene, because that's where really it kind of was coming from, honestly. So something I kind of wonder is, you looking at it from when it came out to now in 2018, are you able to kind of look back and be like, fuck, I kind of was an asshole and I didn't realize how great this record was?
Oh, yeah.
Or were you able to be like, this record's great, but however, in my 2000, I think this came out in 2005? In 2005, like, me was like, this is why I don't like it. Are you able to look back at those same differences as to why you said you didn't like this record maybe when it came out initially? Are you able to kind of reconcile, like, God, I was so
There's
wrapped
not a lot
up
of
in this thing or this
reconciliation.
thing.
There's not a lot of reconciliation, because what it is that, like, you know, I always joke with Joe and Geoff about how, like, 2005 me would have beaten 2018 me's ass.
Why?
You know what I mean?
Why,
like,
though?
because back then I was only into heavy shit.
Metal elitist.
I was totally that. I even did like a Christian metalcore magazine, not a metalcore shit. I did a Christian metal magazine back in 2005 that ran until about 2006, until I started my own band. And like, I ran that magazine, and I remember like we were not allowed to talk about metalcore on that.
Why?
We even had a
weren't you?
podcast. Again, you're asking like somebody that wasn't very mature. You know, it was basically just, you know, again, it's one of those, like, you're asking me how I felt, you know, basically as a teen, you know, versus how I feel now. I've loosened up a lot over the years, in the sense of like musical appreciation, especially, and even like from the spiritual side of it, which I know Joe hates it when we go into this territory. But back then, I was very much the conservative Christian. You know, like 2000, and I would say from like 2000 until 2005 was like kind of my heyday as far as being like conservative Christian. Not that much fun to talk to, you know, like it was very much like I'm right, you're wrong. If you don't agree with what I agree with, then you're a piece of shit. And it's one of those really tough situations where, you know, because I mean, you can, if you look hard enough, you can find our old shit online, you know.
Well, do you feel like doing this discography discussion has allowed you to go back and reconcile some of your misconceptions about albums and
Absolutely.
who you were?
That's the whole purpose of this.
Absolutely.
That this has always been, since the beginning, has been a kind of a way for me to, and like we never thought we'd be talking to people or anything like that, but like we've gotten there.
People.
Yeah, fucking people, fucking other podcasters
You
and
fucking
shit.
people.
God.
All these assholes named John, seriously.
But like, I mean,
They have ages I don't. So
you're asking
not talking
me.
about
You're asking me to reconcile feelings I had back in a time where if somebody said
What's
"fuck,"
this? What's this?
If
The
somebody
feelings
said
that I had.
yeah, if somebody said "fuck" in an interview, I would be like, "This is
You
not.
should have been on that.
This is not a Christian band." You know, like that was the kind of person I was back then. And so there were a lot of things that I did that didn't, like, looking back on it, didn't make sense. And so, like, having feelings about bands, like, it was literally probably something as stupid as they have melodic choruses, I don't give a shit.
Question I have for both of you, all of you, because I don't think you've talked about this even in doing some of the Christian hardcore bands that you've done. So something that was big around here, and since you guys are somewhat near me here in the Midwest, did you guys have, like, the Courage Crew at some of your shows, at the Christian hardcore shows?
The Courage Crew?
Courage Crew. They were Christian.
I think I know what you're talking about, but they weren't called that down here.
What were
They didn't
they
show up
called
at any
down
of our
here?
shows. I mean,
What were
there
they
were
called down
groups
there?
of people that would show up, but I don't remember what they were called.
They were the Spirit Squad. No.
The Spirit
Actually,
Squad,
I think that
nice.
is one of them.
No, I meant
Sam's
that as
Dolph Ziggler.
Yeah, as I say,
Right.
I meant it as a wrestling inside joke.
Yeah,
You know the wrestling's
No,
not
for
going to
sure.
be on the
Yeah.
podcast, right, Geoff?
Yeah, but no.
okay.
So like here in the Michigan area, we had like when I would go see like around the time of Shadows of Security, where I had my hoodie that I wore first thing. There was such thing as like a Christian hardcore group called like the Courage Crew, and it was like they were straight edge. They didn't drink, they didn't smoke, they didn't whatever. They went to all these like bands of that ilk, and basically if they found you like smoking when you could still smoke during shows in the venue, they would
Beat the shit out of you.
Yeah, no, exactly.
No, I know what you're
The
talking
glory
about.
days.
I don't know what they were called down here, but there was I was telling you about my straight edge friend down here. He talked about these guys, and I can't remember their fucking name to save my life.
They were just either the straight edge scene kids or the Christian scene kids down here.
And for me, I can't speak on behalf of all of you three. Was that a big part of going to see live shows for all of you? Like the fact that those people would come out?
To be honest, I don't think so. I remember youth groups would come out. Like I remember going to see Zayo back in like 2002 or 2003, and they were, and I remember a bus showed up, like a church bus showed up, and like all these kids came out wearing Zayo shirts and Living Sacrifice shirts, and I remember thinking like, well, Zayo's not even a Christian band anymore, you know, like they haven't been for a long time, but like these people still showed up because like back then it was still a little bit murky. As far as like, because I remember Zayo put out the Funeral God CD in 2004, which kind of had spiritual overtones to it, and like that, I remember like everybody was still really on board until they put out the Fear, and it was like everybody was like, oh, when they put out the Fear, they were like, oh, this is not a Christian band. It's like, yeah, I've been telling you guys that for years, but like it was one of those things where it wasn't like a big deal. Like we didn't necessarily have a dedicated group that would come out and support these bands or whatever. But, I mean, I definitely think that the Christian side of it was always really, like, kind of a stretch, so to speak. It was like, we want to take these bands that exist, that we really have nothing to do with, Like, we don't know the people in the band personally,
and we want to take ownership.
We want to take ownership of it. We want to
Totally.
we want to take what they're saying doctrinally and like make it what we're about now. And again, that's another huge contradiction between me back then versus me now. Now I'm like, you know, I can say that freely. Like, they're trying to make something that isn't about them. And like, that was very much the case with those As I Lay Dying, which we're going to get into.
That was the mid 2000s.
Yes, like, it was really just one of those things where they were torchbearers. So people that were Christians were like, yeah, these guys are great, especially whenever we get to the next record, An Ocean Between Us, which again, As I Lay Dying was super Christian on like their first 3 or 4 records.
Three.
You know?
The fourth I'll definitely talk about the change lyrically for me.
That's interesting because I'm going to talk about a song called Upside Down Kingdom with you.
Yes.
On that one, and you know, we'll definitely get into that. But like,
all right,
I think that the band, you know, definitely they were the torchbearers of Christian metalcore at the time, regardless of how anybody else feels. And not to sound like Jesse Smith from Zayo, but I don't care what fucking scene kid is listening to this podcast right now. If you were in the Christian metalcore scene or the metalcore scene at large at that time, there's no denying that As I Lay Dying was absolutely the biggest band there, because I have noticed that since the big horrible thing that we're going to talk about later happened, there's been a lot of revisionist history about metalcore and about, you know, like who started it and who was responsible. Everybody's kind of trying to cut As I Lay Dying out of the game because of what happened. And I think that is absolute pissing in the face of what actually took place.
This is a question for Geoff.
Yeah.
Is this the time when it stopped being Christian metalcore and just started being metalcore?
No, I not necessarily. I do want to go back to one thing real quick. We were talking about like why they were so popular, and Dan kind of gave his answer. I never really got to interject.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. I think one thing that people don't realize, and I think it's also why it was important when we talked about the Gothenburg sound and those bands, and it's the groundswell of local acceptance in SoCal and in Phoenix, where As I Lay Dying really put down their roots. Metal and harder music is more popular. There's more radio stations in that area, especially compared to like here. I guess because we're in St. Louis, there's nothing. But it was easier to get on the radio in those areas. It was better. It was easier to be supported because there was more like minds. There was more people listening to that. You know, listening to heavier music in the Southwest U.S. And I think that is actually helped them become who they were. I'm not saying it's the only thing. I'm just saying it helped. I think if As I Lay Dying came from Wichita, Kansas, they would be nowhere near as big as what they ended up becoming because of where they were at and who was able to support them. Just like how you talk about, with Grand Rapids, there's like this, there's a group there that's supporting them. You go up to New England, there's a group there supporting them. You go down to Florida, there's a group there supporting them. So I think where your roots are and where you're coming up from, there's certain parts of the U.S. just like how there's certain parts of like if you go to Japan, metal's big in Japan. You go to Brazil, metal's big in Brazil. I mean, like, it depends on where you're at, depends on how big you can become if you're in the right place at the right time. And I think they absolutely were.
Big in Japan, see what you did there?
Yes, I did.
Thank you, sir.
So I just wanted to throw that in there real quick because I think that because of, where they were, I think actually helped them tremendously.
What's interesting to me about what you're just saying is the fact that I feel like As I Lay Dying really separated themselves from the West Coast metalcore scene, because you had bands like Bleeding Through who were incorporating the strings and orchestral type things with Marta on keys and so forth. And really the only band that I felt like was kind of including more of that Gothenburg kind of European sound, honestly, would have been at the time. I'm totally blanking on their name. would have been like Chimera. Chimera was like one of the few bands that was kind of incorporating everything that was swirling into what was becoming the sound that was happening. And I mean, we're talking about two bands between Bleeding Through and Chimera, who I still feel like never really got their just due, who are actually now, I mean, Bleeding Through just put out a new song like days ago, and the internet's going fucking rabid over it. And it's like, that band's been around for like a long time. Where the fuck were all of you when that band was like putting out like seminal albums like The Truth, Love Lost in a Hail of Gunfire, which what was that record off of? This Is Love, This Is Murderous. That was the record. But I mean, like, there were so many bands putting out records that were like incorporating that In Flames, Dark Tranquility, At the Gate sound that like didn't get their just due, who are now just putting out records where people were like, this band's legit. I love this band. Where the fuck have they been all my life? And I'm like, they were around 20 years ago when you weren't fucking born. Like, do you guys find this? Like, do you guys as 30 something, 40 something year old people, do you guys just like when you hear people talk about like what's new and what's relevant, do you just like do what I'm doing right now where you're like rubbing your forehead going like, where the fuck were you in like 2003, 2004 where like so many bands were like putting their stamp on the sound that you're saying is your sound now?
The answer to that question is they were listening to As I Lay Dying and Killswitch Engage. Because that's what was popular.
Right.
But I don't feel like, honestly, I wonder that, because I mean, like, when I talk to people, when I go to Killswitch Engage shows, and like, I'm like, do you remember when As a Library Just Breathing came out? And they're like, no. And I'm like, do you remember?
I do.
And I'm like, do you remember when, you know, End of Heartache came out? They're like, I wasn't born. And I'm like, fuck. And then, like, I talk to these people, and they're like, well, I got into Attack, and then I got into, you know, like, Disarm the Scent by To Killswitch Engage, and I'm like, I mean, I'm glad you got to Killswitch Engage, and I'm glad you, like, maybe are going back and seeing where, like, the scene came from, but, like, do you guys, like, get, like, the elderly statesmen of the scene? Do you get that same, like, kind of headache that I get sometimes going to shows where you're like, man, there's like, was I really at the forefront of this like new thing that's still popular 20 years later?
Yes, you were. And like that's the whole part of it, is that like, and especially in the case of a band like As I Lay Dying. Okay. Most of the people, I wouldn't say most, but probably 60% of the people that listen to As I Lay Dying were listening to them because they were a religious-based band.
Do you really think that?
I do. Especially at that time, I think there was a lot.
Can I make the poll? Out of the four of us, who was religious upon hearing As I Lay Dying when they first heard them?
I was not.
I was not.
Even though the first time I heard it was at a Baptist university, it's just because my friend was religious.
But that's the point I'm trying to make, is that the people that promoted them the most early on were Christians.
Yeah, outside of
people that wanted, and they may not have even mentioned that the band was a religious-based band at the time, because they wanted you to just listen to it and they wanted you to hear God's message or whatever. But like, it was one of those like situations where I feel like there was a huge push. I mean, like you were saying, John, there were people showing up at shows where their entire purpose was to spread that message, right? Even if the band wasn't necessarily associated with that message directly, they were trying to bridge the gap. So I think that a lot of it had to do with the fact that, like, it's kind of like when Linkin Park's Hybrid Theory came out. You know, it's a very similar type of situation where As I Lay Dying was this ball-busting heavy metal band that was playing like a cutting-edge style, but all their shit was squeaky clean. Okay. Like unlike a lot of metalcore bands at the time, or even like emo core bands or whatever you had at that time. Okay, like they weren't putting out records like Too Bad You're Beautiful.
Okay.
They weren't putting out records about like killing a girl and burying her in your basement. You know, they weren't saying fuck every 10 seconds. You know,
not
they
like
weren't
New Under Oath.
Exactly. They weren't saying fuck every 10 seconds. They weren't talking about murder. They weren't talking about doing drugs. They weren't talking about alcoholism. They weren't talking about all of these things that are very real that we actually will experience at some point in our lives. Okay, they
Right.
weren't talking about any of that. So in a lot of the ways, and this is, oh God, I hope this doesn't show up on Blabbermouth or something, but like, I feel like a lot of Christian metal, a lot of Christian hardcore and stuff kind of lives in a fantasy world where all this shit doesn't exist. The drug addiction doesn't exist. The heartbreak doesn't exist. The real life that we live as human beings doesn't actually exist in that world. So it's this whole idea of like pushing this message, pushing this idea, pushing this worldview. And I think As I Lay Dying was absolutely part of that in the beginning. And I think that, I feel like a lot of the people, and part of the reason for the popularity was that like I get to listen to this super heavy band, but it's safe. Like I don't have to listen. They're not saying anything that's like necessarily like really challenging me. They're not saying anything that like I feel like I can relate to, So like you look at a lot of these bands that were out at the same time had much darker subject matter and much, Whereas like I even to bring Haste the Day back into it, I think I said that Haste the Day is kind of like vanilla ice cream, in the sense that they are they're totally digestible. And it's enjoyable, and it's fun. And I think As I Lay Dying was kind of the same way, especially on these first 3 records, because, again, Christians could get behind it. People that weren't Christians could get behind it. It was like the perfect cocktail that everybody could enjoy. And I think that's part of the reason for the popularity of the band, because I used to ask the same questions you're asking now, John. Like, how did a band this heavy get popular?
I think it's just the fact, are we ready to go to Shadows of Security? Because like I feel like that is really the. All right,
Ocean Between Us.
I'm sorry, Ocean Between Us. So, Ocean Between Us, honestly, and so I'm kind of one of those like nostalgic, where does everything land? Let's look at the progression of everything kind of go. So, Shadows of Security debuted at number 35 on the top 200 Billboard. Ocean Between Us debuted at number 8.
Yep.
That kind of just speaks to what metalcore was and where Lamb of God. Whereas
it's a different episode.
You were thinking Lambesis and then it turned into Lamb of God. That's what happened.
Well, they toured with Lamb of God quite a bit over the last 2 records, because they did the Sounds of the Underground. They did a lot of Taste of Chaos. They did a lot of very interesting tours that I don't feel like a lot of bands of their ilk did. And I don't know if that's just because of the band being very self-conscious and being like, oh, we need to get on these like younger and younger tours, like a Taste of Chaos, like the Warped Tour. I remember seeing this band on Warped Tour on this record cycle, and when they played Detroit, it was a big deal because it was the last date of them being on Warped Tour, and they were the headlining band over all of Warped Tour. And hearing songs off of An Ocean Between Us, I was like, holy shit, this band is fucking no one. Yeah, of course they're headlining Warped Tour because they fucking deserve it. And that's in lieu of seeing, I saw Norma Jean on that, like they were the second band to, open that tour, and they were on I think they were on Redeemer. And I gotta say, they were terrible. And Gym Class Heroes put them to shame and had a better pit early in the morning.
Are we gonna stop being friends about Norma Jean?
Oh, he says the live show doesn't mean that's.
No, I've definitely seen some terrible Norma Jean
Here's
shows.
the thing. Yeah. I'm actually going to talk to Ryan now from Ex-Heated, now Norma Jean, in the next couple of weeks. So maybe I should talk to you about Norma Jean shit. Because
maybe I should co-host that episode.
Yeah, I will say this. I think An Ocean Between Us is the peak of commercialized metalcore. You disagree?
No. I agree, but I sort of disagree. So I'll say my piece on An Ocean Between Us, and I'll let you collectively all get to it, because I'm interested to see what the rest of you all feel about this. So very much in the sense that like how I described like me getting into this band, going to Hot Topic and seeing their CD and the album getting, really being very interesting to me from an album cover. I didn't know Jacob Bannon. I wasn't into Converge. I didn't understand how great he was as a multi what's the fucking word I'm looking for? Visual artist of sorts, between his own band and everything he has done since, and even into Shadows of Security. I didn't know Jacob Bannon did that record album artwork as well. But An Ocean Between Us, obviously I'm huge into Killswitch by the time this record comes out. Adam D can do no fucking wrong as far as production, everything he does. And at this point, Colin Richardson coming back and doing the second record with Adam D, or I'm sorry, with mastering, mixing, and so forth. But I mean, Adam D at this point is at the pinnacle of like that metalcore sound, between Killswitch, between Underoath, between doing an Unearth album, between doing everything that Adam D has done up until this point production wise. Like, he has proven that he is the quintessential, like, if you're looking for that sound, scooped mids on your guitars, just crushing drums, everything about the production, Adam D is everything you were looking for and then some. And the sad thing is Adam D only got better from here on out. But as far as this band, this record is concerned, An Ocean Between Us, I remember working at Logan's Roadhouse, the fucking steakhouse, and I was working a double, and the day this record came out, I was chomping at the bit to get done with my first shift so I could walk across the street to go to Target to buy this fucking record, listen to it on my Sony Discman that I brought with me so I could listen to the new record in my like hour and a half or to 2 hours of like not working. And that's exactly what I did. And I feel like that's something that's lost on a lot of people nowadays, of like being so enamored with a band and their new record that you're like actively seeking out going to get the new music. Like today, my wife and I were driving around doing different shit, for our weekend and so forth. And I listened to the new Cardi B. I listened to the new, we listened to all the new shit that came out on iTunes. And I was thinking, in leading up to our discussion about this album and the records that have come out from As Lay Dying, just thinking about how I knew where I was going to be the day a record came out and how far away from a record store I was going to be, or somewhere where I could buy the record so I can go literally buy the physical media of the thing. And I don't think, obviously, people don't have that invested interest in music nowadays. But I remember when I bought this record, I was like, wow, this band with Adam D took the next fucking level. Like, they are heads and shoulders above and beyond anything anyone is doing in this scene. And I don't know if any of you agree with that, but or can remember where you were when you first heard this record. But fuck, this record was and still to this day, if I honestly gotta say, if I'm going back and listening to As Lay Dying, this is the record I'm going back and listening to and being this is a full record. This is a band fully realizing how to write a full album, parts leading into one another, taking what they've done from Frail Words Collapse into Shadows of Security, and just Phil and everyone executing on all levels. This is a band basically being we are the it band of this genre.
You're 100% correct, because this is the album I hear every time I listen to insert name of otherwise seemingly generic metalcore band, because this is the album everybody ripped off.
Totally.
And I think that's why I view it as the peak. Is because
this is the peak to you?
Yeah, it really is, because
everything after this is kind of a repeat of itself.
Yeah, it really it
totally.
is. I mean, that, like you said, Adam D from Killswitch, and the guys from As It Lay Dying, they essentially found all the formulas and perfected it, and this is what we got. I mean, this is perfect radio play material for metalcore. I mean, this is, in my opinion, this is as good as it gets for people who are going to be, if you want to be I think this is a perfect album to be introduced to metal if you've never listened to metal before, and you
metal
want
or metalcore?
Metal that isn't power metal.
Okay.
So, the reason why, or symphonic metal, I exclude those because that's exclusively
That's
clean.
a damn good point, sir.
What?
That is a really good point.
The difference between metal and power metal.
Yeah.
That's a damn good point.
Yeah, so
That's a good point.
If you exclude those, I think this is the perfect intro course into metal.
Hold on.
That's
Go
just,
ahead.
but
Sorry.
that's just me. And I think it's because it's got the poppy sensibilities. You got the choruses. You got the melody. You got the clean singing, but you also got all of that meatiness of what we enjoy about metal. There, I think it's the perfect blend for the casual listener to be introduced. And in my opinion, that's why this album is the peak. Because this is what everybody else afterwards strived to be.
Geoff, did you just prove that As I Lay Dying killed the 80s once and for all?
Yeah.
Insert
Dan, I
Final
really wanna
Fantasy
know what
victory
you think
music
of this.
right here.
All right. Cue that one.
Dan's looking at CDs, looking distraught. I gotta know what he thinks of this record.
He definitely is. I'm sure is of a different opinion than I.
I'm not.
Really?
I'm really not.
Wow.
Are we all in agreement on a record?
So this
Holy
was,
shit.
I remember
This
when
is
I
weird.
first heard An Ocean Between Us.
What? Take us through your first experience listening to this record.
Okay, so I was prepping up for my band End of Destiny. I was prepping up for what ended up being our final show, which was at Cornerstone Festival.
Okay, time out just for a second. How big was? I mean, because I know you've obviously talked about Christian metal bands. How big has Cornerstone been for the bands that you've talked about? Because I don't
Huge.
think I've really seen you talk about any of those. The Cornerstone Festival as a whole, really.
Huge. So
For you personally, or for everybody?
for everybody.
For this scene.
Okay,
So
no, totally. I totally
Cornerstone-
agree.
I always tell this story. We went and saw a punk band called Blaster the Rocket Man at Cornerstone Festival one year. And he was joking about how, like, just a few years ago, all the bands sounded like Korn,
Yep.
you know, at Cornerstone Festival, because that's what Christian music typically did. Is it was like maybe 3-4 years behind whatever the trend was in popular music, except in the case of metalcore. In metalcore, for some strange reason, Christian music was at the bleeding edge of it. So he was like, and now whenever I go, he's like, when I used to walk past tents, I would just hear, you know, drop D guitars and, you know, all this stuff. He's like, but now whenever I walk past the tent, all I hear is coming from, you know, like hissing coming from every tent.
Right.
I remember, okay, so in 2004, it was right before Zao had dropped their Funeral God record. I remember Scott from Zao telling everybody that as soon as they were done playing, that they needed to run to another stage and go see As I Lay Dying. And he said that they were the most popular band out now. So I didn't, but it was one of the, because I got really hurt during that Zao show, and like I didn't fracture 2 ribs, but god damn if it didn't feel like it. And
Okay.
I got hurt pretty bad during that one, and ended up having to go home. We went home that night, and because we live about 4 hours away from Bushnell in St. Louis, so we drove home overnight. And so I remember that being a huge deal. I remember seeing As I Lay Dying play the main stage at Cornerstone Festival. That was right after Shadows of Security came out, and I watched the whole show, and they just killed it. I mean, they were just obviously like, and there were good bands before them. I think As Cities Burn started off the show, and then it was followed by Norma Jean, and this was like right when Redeemer came out. And then after that was As I Lay Dying, and like As I Lay Dying, I mean, just wiped the floor with Norma Jean, which is something that I didn't think was popular. And then I remember Under Oath played after As I Lay Dying, and I remember I actually went and saw some black metal band play instead of Under Oath, because I was still kind of an asshole at that time, and I was even like wanting to leave when As I Lay Dying came on because I couldn't appreciate it. I was just in this weird mindset. And so we played Cornerstone Festival, not on the main stage, and we played actually sandwiched between 2 black metal bands, which is kind of ironic
Generator stage.
because our band definitely sounded more like Under Oath than like black metal. But
Okay.
I didn't see it that way at the time, but you know, we did. We had the keyboards and all that, but like it was to go back to that record. I listened to that record a few times because I went to Cornerstone that festival. It's kind of weird because in 2007, might sound like a familiar story. I got hurt because I was supposed to be at Cornerstone the entire time until our band played, and I got hurt, went home for 2 days, and then got together with the band and then drove up and played the show. It's so funny too because that video is still on YouTube somewhere. You can see us towards the end of our set. I'm like holding my side really bad and like not like being that animated because I was hurting really bad.
That's right. He wasn't being a scene kid.
Yeah.
He was actually trying to hold it together.
I also wasn't fat then. I mean, I thought I was fat, but compared to now,
you were fat by scene kids.
That was like 170 pounds ago, man. But
this is before fat was the new skinny.
Right. So I remember I listened to this record. And I thought because in 2007 I was done with Christian music.
Why? Why were you?
Because it was fucking terrible. The metalcore bands were cool, but like I said, I was drifting further and further away from metalcore. And so I started getting into like underground Christian death metal bands, which goes from being pretty decent to not so good. And I was checking out stuff like, I was like really into bands like Mortification and stuff like that, which were like fucking terrible, especially in 2005, 2006. And that was in the heyday of when I was doing my magazine. And I remember hearing a record by a band called Mortification, their record Erasing the Goblin. And it was like really fucking terrible. And I was like, I'm done. Like that's the record that broke me from just listening to Christian music. Because I think before that, I kind of knew about other bands, but I didn't really check them out because they weren't Christian or whatever. So whenever I started my own band, I kind of went off and was like, fuck you guys, I'm going to go listen to Converge. I'm going to go listen to Bleeding Through. And, I'm going to go listen to Coalesce, like bands like that. And so I got kind of a different foundation for metalcore than what I had prior, because before that it was all Zao, all Living Sacrifice, all Christian bands, all clean cut, perfect stuff for your mom or whatever. And I think that was just part of growing up, is being like, I like this kind of music. Why am I not giving all these other great bands a chance? When I've just been basically sidelining them and saying, yeah, they're okay, but they're not great, So I was out of Christian music at this time, but I did still pick up Shadows of Security. Fuck. An Ocean Between Us. And, I remember thinking I remember the very first thought I had, and I was listening to Nothing Left. The first thought I had was unstoppable. Like, this band is unstoppable. Like, they can't do it wrong. They never even all the way through Awakened, they didn't really have a bad record. They didn't have one that you were like, this is the obvious misstep in their career. And so for An Ocean Between Us, yeah, I heard a little bit of the Gothenburg, but it was less so than what I had on Shadows of Security. Shadows of Security was unabashedly a product of its time. Whereas, you had a lot of different, like there's a song on An Ocean Between Us called Within Destruction that's like very Slayer.
Oh, yeah.
Which was really out of left field for me. And I remember thinking, okay, these guys are back to doing stuff that's like really interesting. And that was whenever my appreciation for the band actually grew more so than it had been back in the Christian metal days, because I was like, these guys can't do any wrong. Everything they put out is solid fucking gold.
Did anyone else pick up on An Ocean Between Us? The fact that it felt like more of a full record as far as songs segueing into one another, just thinking about a record as such, not just as individual songs, parts, everything. Did everyone can we all agree that like An Ocean Between Us really was like the first sonically full record that the band had done start to finish with a concept?
Sequencing was really important on this record.
Yeah.
They really thought about what order to put these songs in.
You kind of saw that a little bit on An Ocean Between, or Shadows of Security, like a little bit. But like, I think this is really the first record where you see the band really looking at a record as a full record. I don't know if anyone else saw that or looked back on that listening to this, leading up to this discussion. But
you definitely did, because this was the end of albums and the beginning of
That's a good point.
the singles culture coming back.
Yeah,
That's
I
a
mean,
good point.
that's really because that's when, Pandora, iTunes, Spotify, all that stuff really started hitting. No,
this is right when iTunes appeared.
Yeah,
yes, you're
this
totally
is
right.
this is so easy to listen to cover.
Yes.
And I'm a
Yeah.
You can ask these guys here. I'm a huge proponent of that. Like that's a very, very important thing for me on whether I rate an album is good or great or bad or whatever. And I think that's one of the things that makes this album fan-fucking-tastic is that it's so easy to put on, hit play,
And just listen.
to the whole fucking thing in its entirety. There's no, desire to want to skip a track. There's no filler. I mean, I hate to say it, but because it's a Sum 41 thing.
It's a great Sum 41 record.
All killer, no filler.
I love that record.
Yeah, but that's
I made a Sum 41 joke on my Instagram page yesterday.
So yeah, I guess you could say that's a guilty pleasure of mine as well. But I think that's true when it comes to this. This album is all killer, no filler. There's a purpose to everything on this,
And it all leads into one another.
Yeah, it really does. And it's so lacking in a lot of music, especially what's popular in the U.S. That's why I think that's probably why I end up going over to European metal for a lot of the stuff that I like, and actually Brazilian metal too. Brazil's
like what?
There's a ton of, if you like power metal, Brazil is a good place to go to. But that's just me.
Okay.
But I do like a little bit of power metal, but American metal just doesn't have it right now for me, I guess. That's just more, I think that's probably more a personal opinion thing than it is anything else. It doesn't mean that everything that comes out from America I dislike. It just means that I think we're struggling with acceptance in metal in the U.S. right now as a collective whole.
Well, we're still pushing metalcore bands that haven't been relevant in 5-10 years.
Right.
And I think that's the issue, is there hasn't been that push forward. I mean, we had deathcore, which kind of erupted out of metalcore. But the problem with something like deathcore is that it's so extreme that you're not going to have the same fan base. You're going to have the same built-in appreciation for it like people had for metalcore.
So, kind of really piggybacking right off of that into, speaking of power metal bands, into the next As I Lay Dying record, Powerless Rise. Interestingly enough, I feel like this record is way more extreme on the extreme ends of where Shadows of Security went with the, death metal, blast beats and so forth. Oddly enough, where An Ocean Between Us debuted at number 8, this debuted at number 10 on the Billboard. So, it kind of speaks to the fact that, around that time, metal and just angry, pissed off music was, really, viable. And what's weird in looking back at this record, the Powerless Rise was always a record that I always listened to and I really enjoyed in conjunction to everything that As I Lay Dying had put out. But it always seemed like where the tail end of An Ocean Between Us lyrically started kind of venturing into not Christian lyrics. Powerless Rise really is just straight up the Christian faith is abandoned. This is where Tim's all gloves are off. We're going just down the path of a typical metal hardcore record where it's this is how I feel, and it's not cool, kosher, whatever. And I kind of really love the fact that this is just really pissed off and brutal, and takes the sonic landscapes of An Ocean Between Us, because again they're back with Adam D and Colin Richardson on production and engineering, and just takes what they had done on that record and just takes it a step further as far as the extreme level of that of the band. I don't know if anyone else really picked up on that, but
That's the next logical step for any band that bases their existence on a spiritual message. Doesn't matter
You
what
think
that
so?
message is. I think eventually everybody runs out of things to say. Unfortunately, not everybody can be Slayer and just be heavy all the time.
well,
Especially when you had a scene band, whether they were the As I Lay Dying or the Under Oath style of scene. They were because that's what they were. I think most of them are just destined to run out of things to say because at their core, they don't just want to sit here until the end of time and tell you how much Jesus loves you. I think they want to say something that is relevant to them as people. And like Dan has mentioned before, when you started off saying something that you were told and not necessarily something that you had any real life experience with, eventually that seems fake to you internally. So you have to actually start talking about things that you're qualified to discuss, which for the majority of metal artists is real life and anger and frustration.
I think this record was still Christian.
Really?
can I speak on what
Yes.
you just said
Yes.
previous to what Dan was just saying? So collectively, like, I know Tim has said on numerous occasions that basically this was an ocean between us and the powerless rise were really the shift in his Christian beliefs and pushing the Christian word in his lyrical content. Now, beyond that, though, I mean, you just kind of were saying that, like, there gets to a point where the band kind of gets to where they're at as far as being a few years into their career and so forth and just kind of pushing an agenda. I'm really interested, like, because I know how I kind of spoke on how I felt about this record a little bit, but like being fans of this band, where was everyone at when they first heard this record? Because to me, like, I remember hearing this record and be like, oh shit, like this band's pissed, and like I don't feel like this is a band that's a Christian metalcore band anymore. This is really the first record from start to finish where I go, yeah, I think they're starting to feel kind of how I feel about Christianity and a lot of the things that are going on in my life because these people are around my same age. So like, where was everyone else with this record and the lyrical content and so forth?
Well, there's a song on this record called Upside Down Kingdom.
Yep.
And the reason I say that this record still held some sort of Christian belief is really based on one lyric. But again, when Christian metal fans, they stretch for that. It's always it's always a stretch, right?
There's a couple of
So-
songs on here that I definitely think could still lean toward that. I mean, I think Anodyne C leads towards still being a Christian-based band, but I think if you really look at the lyrics and what they mean per how Tim's putting it out, I think it really represents the thing of like looking at Christianity and how he believes in it from a perspective of like not believing anymore and trying to figure out what that means. That's me though, as never being a Christian person.
I think he was very much where I was at the time. It's like I said, I'd kind of left Christian music and left that whole scene kind of behind at that time. But there was a lyric that stood out to me on that one, on Upside Down Kingdom, which was, he says, "Simplicity is not a curse where strength is humbled, and the powerless rise. This is a kingdom born upside down. This is a kingdom where the broken are crowned." Which really falls into that whole, like, the meek shall inherit the earth, aspect of Christianity. But I definitely get what you're saying as far as, like, this record was more transitional. I don't think it was necessarily a statement of unbelief, but I think it was more transitional in the fact that, like, this is what I grew up in, this is what I was taught, this is what I believed, or still believe maybe to some extent, but there are definitely issues that I have with it, or at the very least have with the other people that are involved in it, where they're trying to either put words in my mouth or they're trying to take something that's not about them and make it about them, like we talked about earlier. So I definitely see the frustration, but like after this record came out, there was definitely a shift in Tim's belief system, because he did a death metal band called like Pyrathon at the time, and I remember thinking the music was really cool. And he was also doing Austrian Death Machine at the same time, which was just like a funny thing. But like, it was funny because with Pyrithian, I remember like actually reading some of Tim's blog posts that he had put up after this and talking about like his issues that he had with Christianity. He very much had a very similar journey to what I had, which was, you know, these faith healings that people use as proof for Christianity. Like, all of that has been proven to be false or proven to be some sort of deception in some way. And that, you know, Christian Science is a dead end, you know, in that, like, they're just aping off of real science, but then, like, also throwing in shit that's not necessarily true. And a lot of that is what caused me to leave the whole Christian music scene and to have anything to do with that, because I didn't necessarily want to be associated with people that just make shit up in order to support this belief system that's supposed to be true, you know? And so that was a big issue that I had. Now, I actually did come away from it with, like, I'm still all about, like, the God and Jesus part of it, but I'm not so much about, like, all the shit that comes with it, you know, like the whole, you know, you're not supposed to approve of homosexuals. You're not supposed to, you know, approve of, you know, cursing or drinking or whatever. Like, nowadays I live in a world that's much more complex than that. And it's not really like, you know, like the thing about Christianity that stood out to me was the whole idea of I'm not perfect. I'm somebody that, you know, probably doesn't fit the criteria for somebody that should get into heaven. Or whatever, if you believe in that sort of stuff. But like all the other shit that comes with it, like faith healing and, you know, not believing in dinosaurs and believing that like the devil planted dinosaur bones to confuse people, and like it gets really metaphysical and it gets really weird, and it's something that I can't really like put my stamp of approval on as a person. Like, I love talking to people, I love meeting people, I love understanding what their journey is, and all that. So, like, I still have that love and compassion for people that Jesus teaches that I don't feel like a lot of the followers of Jesus really embody. Like, it's one of those, like, you're really cool until we find out something about you that we don't like. And now all of a sudden you're ostracized from us. You know, so, like, I have always had that personal belief that, like, you're doing more for people when you're doing things for people versus... like,
you're definitely
people.
hitting on my challenges that I have with people that are really entrenched in Christianity to the point that they don't understand what perspective is. Because they're so obsessed with pigeonholing and judging, and that's everything that I thought that Christianity was not supposed to be. I will say this though about this album: I hardly listened to it back in the day. This is right about a year before this is when I really went off the deep end. And you can ask like Dan and Joe. I love finding the weird, obscure shit that like has only gotten like 200 listens, and they're from some weird ass small village in Switzerland. I mean, I really started trying to find the most obscure stuff I could find and really listening to it. I got really disillusioned with metalcore and the popularity of, I guess what was popular at the time, which is essentially was metalcore, and before that, nu metal. I had no interest in anything that sounded like that. I tried to find the most bizarre, weird shit I could find. So that I'm gonna be upfront. I'll be at a loss for most of the rest of this discussion because these last two albums just didn't do it for me at all.
So what's interesting about this time frame for me is growing up here in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Pretty close friend of mine, Jason Wood, was in this band. Camilla, who the guitar player I ended up being roommates with, and he almost made it to be the final guitar player for Limp Bizkit when they were doing that searching for a guitar player thing. So, and this is all really wrapped in the same time frame, so it's really fucking weird. So my eventual old roommate almost became the replacement for Wes Borland and Limp Bizkit. The first single from Limp Bizkit, "Eat You Alive," was actually a riff my friend wrote and has on his old hard drives, like literally the first incarnations of said song before he went and jammed it with Limp Bizkit, because a part of that process was you had to bring your own shit to it. You couldn't just play covers, you couldn't do whatever, you had to bring your own stuff so they knew you could write your own stuff. Now the flip side of that is you had to sign away your rights to the songs that you had written. And so yeah, "Eat You Alive" is basically one of my old roommates. The verse riff is basically the riff my old roommate wrote. Now, around that same time, the singer of that band that he first started went on to form a band called The Orphan. The Orphan, was a metalcore band, very good. Almost actually got signed to a major label. Almost had Adam D produce what would have been that record that they would have done. Interestingly enough, though, the vocalist was Jason Wood, who went on to fill in for Still Remains, who was a local band from here in Grand Rapids, who was signed to Roadrunner, so on and so forth. Jason ended up becoming the vocalist for It Dies Today on their last record that they put out. So all of that being said, the whole reason I bring that up is the fact that there's a lot of weird lineage to the Christian hardcore scene between the Still Remains guys being obviously friends with Haste Today, Still Remains being friends with As Lay Dying, the Killswitch shit. It's very all incestuous as far as like how everything kind of came to become. And so the reason I bring that up is by the time the Powerless Rise ended up coming out, that was really the last record I was really big on, because there's this weird shift in music scenes, and it almost was like what would sort of become what it is now, where you had bands like Sky Eats Airplanes. I remember seeing As Lay Dying on Warped Tour at the very tail end of An Ocean Between Us record cycle. Norma Jean on the Redeemer album, which I already said was probably the worst set of Warped Tour I saw, much to your chagrin, I'm sure, Dan. And it's one of those things where being so heavily involved in that scene and seeing a lot of bands coming out, by the time there was the album Decus, or there's a few different ways I've heard people say it, and I don't know how any of you say that record, but more or less it was a glorified cover record with like 2 new songs. So I'm not really going to speak on that, because I don't really feel like that was much of a record to speak on, because of it being more of a covers record and a vehicle just to satiate fans between a Powerless Rise to what would become Awakened. But by the time Awakened came out, I feel like the metal scene, metalcore and everything about the scene as it was just changing so heavily to where you were seeing more bands. You were seeing this more like proggy tech scene of like Animals as Leaders, Between the Berries and Me were coming more to prominence. You were seeing, Process the Hero. You were seeing a lot of these kind of bands coming to more dominance in the metal scene. And I feel like a band like As Lay Dying was just kind of going away. And as much as this is not really probably a very favorable reason why I wasn't really into Awakened, between Decus or whatever the fuck you want to call that record, and Awakened, I feel like the visual of those records, and especially the Glorified Records album where they did that video for what was that Judas Priest song they covered? Electric Eye? Yeah, Electric Eye. It was so terrible that by the time Awakened came out, I was like, yeah, I think I'm over this band.
Well, this is 2012. This is when metalcore was kind of starting to take the final bow. And
yeah,
this is the innovator. So they're suffering from the thrash metal bands of the 80s, Metallica, Slayer, to a lesser extent.
Was coming back huge.
Anthrax was coming back huge, but you had those bands that kind of started something that in the mid-90s were fighting to stay relevant, or
Right.
at least they thought they had to fight when really all they had to do was just keep making music and touring.
Yeah.
This was just the band that got all the credit, continuing to do the same thing that they had always done. So in a very saturated market, and it's 2012, we have the internet, we have YouTube, we have access to all this extra stuff that we never had access to prior. You weren't just oversaturated, you oversaturated yourself.
You're nailing it, Joe. Absolutely nailing it. In my opinion, that's exactly what happened. Is it was just more of the same when it came to them. And like you touched on earlier, they're now in the world of the singles. You're now in the world of Spotify and iTunes. You have this huge, technological engine to discover new music. And I fell into it. I ate it up. I went and I found the weirdest shit that I could find. I mean, it was great. I loved it because I still loved metal, but I was getting tired of the metal that I was listening to. I needed something else. I needed to discover. I needed to find something new. And, they had found a formula that worked for them, but it wasn't working for me anymore. And I think there was a lot of people in metal that felt that way, and that you also had the issue with a lot of stations that were turning that off because they weren't getting the market shares that they needed. Unless you were in some of those strongholds that we were talking about before, you weren't able to get the stuff. So you went to the internet, and now you had this entire horizon opened up for you. You weren't stuck with just listening to metalcore or just new metal. You could listen to anything you want. We were globally connected finally, and it I think it was the death knell for this genre as it was at that time, and it's the reason why even though I think the last album I think entered at 11 on the charts, it didn't count the same because there weren't as many albums that were sold. Whenever An Ocean Between Us came in at 8, they were selling probably 10 times what they were at what came in at 11. And that's just because of singles, internet, and everything that Joe touched on earlier. So I think Dan's falling asleep over here.
I'm just waiting.
Waiting your turn
waiting my
patiently.
turn.
I think it's your turn, man.
I'm trying not to be the asshole that I normally am.
Oh, then it wouldn't be our podcast if you weren't.
How many
wouldn't
beers
be.
have you had?
Not enough.
That's the problem.
4. You've been counting? Well, hold
Yeah,
on.
2
Let's
bottles
count
and
this out.
two
1,
cans.
2, 1, 2, 3. 3 cans.
Oh, okay. I
No,
only
some
saw
of those are my
2.
cans.
Well, anyway. So I feel like this is personal opinion.
Then you're wrong.
The correct opinion. So
He emerges.
I don't feel like there is a lot of progression between An Ocean Between Us all the way through Awaken.
It's because there isn't.
They kind of were like, okay, we found the fucking sweet spot, and we're just gonna hit it as many times as we can, because at the end we're gonna profit, and they did profit. I don't think that this record was a failure, but this was definitely like all the bullshit that I thought about the band back in the day, like, oh, they're going commercial, they're going mainstream, they're not, hashtag not my eyes lay dying, like that sort of thing. That was, and again, this is the joke, right? Me back then would beat the ass of me now. Like, if they had put out this record in 2005, absolutely dropped from the godlike status that they had embodied prior. Don't get me wrong, if they'd released Powerless Rise right after Shadows of Security, I'm sure it would have been fine. But, like, Awaken? No fucking way. Especially with the lyrics, the amount of melodic singing that was on the record, the melody, the catchiness, the verse,
The
chorus.
production.
Oh my God, it just wasn't there. Like the band that existed prior does not exist now on this record. And that's true because now they're rich guys, right? Living in California. Maybe they're not rich, but it's just, I think Tim was though, especially when we're going to get into the shit we're going to talk about in a minute, is, they were doing well for themselves. I'm not going to say they were rich, but I'm going to say they were doing well for themselves.
Am I correct in remembering that the two big bands in 2012 that we were tired of hearing, that's how big they were, was As I Lay Dying and Killswitch Engage? Am I correct?
See, I don't think Killswitch Engage fell off the boat like this.
No, I'm not saying they fell off the boat.
Because they had Have you guys done? I don't think you've done Killswitch Engage, have you?
Not
no,
yet.
we have not.
It's coming.
So around this time, Incarnate, not Incarnate. What was the first record with
Engage
Jesse Leach?
self-titled, wasn't it? No, he wasn't on the self-titled. That was still Howard.
Yeah, that was still Howard. The first record was Jesse, which wasn't Incarnate, which was
Descent or something like that.
Disarm the Descent. Yeah.
Disarm the
Descent was first, so which would have come out around the time of this record, shortly thereafter. So actually, since we're talking about this, something I want to talk about. So, kind of thinking about the shift in heavy music at this point and what was becoming popular. Definitely, I agree with everything everyone's saying. The Powerless Rise is a great record. I think it's a great continuation of where An Ocean Between Us left off. Awakened, not so much. I've always felt like that's kind of a cut rate record. It just sounds, production-wise, everything, it just sounds rehashed and just samey, for lack of a better word. Something that's interesting to me, though, is like this is where the beginning of like Bring Me the Horizons, like Sempiternal and That's the Spirit, and like bands of that ilk, of like that overproduced, like, I hate to say like Linkin Park, like around the time, like it's not Meteora-esque, but it's not quite where they were with like whatever the fucking record was shortly after there. But basically, like, you know what I'm saying, like that very radio heavy, like
bass
30
drop
seconds,
deathcore.
Yeah, but not deathcore. Like on Sempiternal and That's a Spirit for Bring Me the Horizon, like they're very commercial records, but like they still hold on to some of the underground influences of where As I Lay Dying's coming from. And I think like maybe like where we were talking earlier about how As I Lay Dying was at the forefront of that new sound that was like not nu metal, it wasn't hardcore per se, but it was at the front of this new thing. I feel like now we're saying that basically all these years later, As I Lay Dying's at the forefront, the tail end of the old sound, and there's all this new shit coming in. You know, the Bring Me the Horizons, the Linkin Parks on the Minutes to Midnight, and that's the record I'm thinking of, Minutes to Midnight, and like a lot of this other stuff where it's like finding this weird hybrid, no pun intended, hybrid of like alternative deathcore, but like with really poppy production, just this weird thing that shifted, and like it's like this weird in between of like your Royal Bloods, your Russian Circles, your things like that, where it's like we're proficient in our musicianship, but we're poppy enough to like gain mainstream fans, but this weird amalgamation of like all these different things. And I feel like at this point, this is really where As I Lay Dying was just kind of resting on their laurels, because maybe, you know, Tim was so focused on Austrian Death Machine, the Pythrian, the all these other things, that everyone in the band was ready to start doing something different. And maybe Awakened was a byproduct of like, yeah, we got to put out another record. We know what we're doing. Let's just put this out.
It's work now. It's our job.
This is also 2012, where even people that didn't have knowledge of music production started to notice that all of the popular metal at this time was very sanitized.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
This is when it was blatantly obvious. My mother noticed that the music sounded the same, no matter who it was.
Well, yeah, like when we had Reed and Christian on from Tetelestai, that's what that whole episode was about, was like what metalcore was versus what it had become later on, you know, when it became a kind of a dirty word for underground metal fans, because there was a time. I mean, and I guess I was the trendsetter back in like 2004 when I was like,
fucking trendsetter.
I'm not into, but no, it was like I'm not into metalcore, because that was whenever you had. Because to me back then, it was like the worst thing in the world to have, like this commercialized version of metalcore, and then in like 2012, it's still going on. Like, holy shit! Like, I couldn't believe that it went on as long as it did. And I think an album like Awaken really kind of like proves that, in that like eventually people are going to have enough and they're going to move on to the
totally
next thing.
jumps the shark, basically.
Yeah.
And I think metal fans, even fans of this genre, in 2012, we were all kind of moving on to the next thing, which was your Between the Buried and Me's and Opeth to a lesser extent. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I think what happened is they got a night record producers.
Hold on, can I cut you off right there for just a second to kind of speak on that?
Go for it.
So up until An Ocean Between Us, it basically was on Frail Words Collapse. It was Evan and Tim that produced Frail Words Collapse. By the time Shadows of Security came out, it was Phil and Tim that produced that record, and they obviously have different people mixing and mastering those records. An Ocean Between Us and Powerless to Rise was Adam D with Colin Richardson mastering those records. So like you went a step above and beyond everything that had happened, and it wasn't until you got back to Awakened where there was kind of a no-name producer back to doing what the band was as far as the sound. And I almost wonder if it's like the band just going like, oh, we know what we do, so like we're good with going with nobody, where it's like the last two records, or even three really if you want to go back to Shadows of Security, where you're just like, maybe it's a band who thought they knew exactly what they were, and they have been progressing every record, and they thought they knew better than everybody else, and it really is what shot them in the foot, is by going like, oh, let's go with somebody else, as opposed to going with what's tried and true and knowing what works. And it actually worked to be a detrimental thing in their career.
I think their sound is nebulous enough over the last several records that I don't think it was a detriment as far as their sound. Maybe the quality is different.
It just sounds like Cut Rate As I Lay Dying to me.
Right, and you're correct, but it still sounds like As I Lay Dying. What I was going to try to get at was the money men, the people who cash in to make the big bucks.
Which is Brian Slagle, which, I mean...
Well, hold on. Not necessarily for As I Lay Dying. I'm talking about the guys that were looking at the big money for the Sleeping with Sirens, Asking Alexandrias, that type of metal, Black Veil Brides, has become popular, and it's popular with the new generation, a young generation, and a lot of them are young girls.
You can say 13-year-old girls.
Yeah, I mean that's.
Can you? Is that a thing we're allowed to say anymore?
Yes.
But that's
pubescent.
Yeah, but that's
very good.
People realize, and this was another natural progression, kind of like what I've talked about, like we started with, hair metal, to grunge, to new metal, to metalcore, to now where we're at right now with what's popular with the, what's considered edgier and what's still considered metal. And that's not our metal. I mean, it's kind of like whenever we had John Drake on, and I'm a big Star Wars fan as well, and he does the Nerf Herder Council. And we've said things along the lines of not my Star Wars kind of thing. And that's kind of how I feel about a lot of this metal that's out right now. It's metal, but it's not our metal. We're the old fogies now. We're the ones that reminisce about,
you are.
Oh yeah, I mean, but we're all in our, 30s. I still got a few more months, and I'm not in my 30s anymore. But I'm gonna damn well say it as long as I can. But that's not who, Black Veil Brides and that kind of stuff is not for us. And it's.
Hold on, is it though? Because like Black Veil Brides started off in the ashes of like what Motley Crue and like those 80s hair metal bands came from. So how, and Avenged Sevenfold, like with Waken the Fallen, like how is it not actually from the ashes of what we started?
Well, yeah, that's because Hollywood recycles everything. I mean, I have a 13-year-old, so I look at the fashion that's in junior high and high school. It's the same.
Old as fuck.
It's the same shit that happened in the late 80s, early 90s. Like, that's a thing again. Like, it's just regurgitating. And that's the reason why I say it's not for us, it's for them.
Aging Visions, Fashion Core.
Oh my God. But do you remember when 18 Visions was a new band?
Yeah, and I went and interviewed James out in LA when I went and saw him.
Oh, okay.
And Davey Havoc from AFI almost hit me in the face because he was hardcore dancing to Tower of Snakes.
Yeah, we get it. You're fucking badass. Anyway, no, it's...
Yeah, I almost got beat in the face by Davey Havoc. I don't know how badass that makes me.
I don't know.
That makes
Well,
two
it
of
He was
us.
wearing like a diaper.
Yeah, as I say, it depends on which AFI was.
Depends.
AFI now.
Sorry, you're actually bringing up. It's a good thing that you brought AFI up because they did it right for their pocketbook. They did the right thing.
Well, they're still doing. Go ahead. Sorry.
They were at the our AFI, is fucking badass, kick you in the teeth kind of punk sound. I love that shit. Their old AFI is so fucking awesome. The new AFI is, they ushered in this pretty boy, 13-year-old girls love you metal.
Go Dan.
Okay, so I'm gonna
Girl Gone Gray. Yeah,
I'm gonna
it's-
push away from
I'm
that.
gonna go right after Dan.
I'm gonna push away from that. I'm gonna change it. So I don't think that As I Lay Dying was necessarily on the downward spiral like we're acting like they were. I mean, maybe they were. Who knows what another record would have sounded like, honestly.
Did anyone? Okay, so hold on. Did anyone? Because I saw the band around this time frame. Did anyone go see the band live around this time frame?
I did not.
Any of you?
No, I was kind of checked out at that point.
Okay, that seems to be the common sentiment from As I Lay Dying fans, and it's definitely what I saw when I went and saw them. Because like I saw them with bands like Carnifex, Unearth, which I mean we already said like were this weird, almost on the cusp of being the biggest band, but they weren't, and they're a band's band, whatever. Like when I saw that tour, it did pretty good in like a mid-sized venue of like a 2,200 cap room, and it did pretty good. But the weird thing is by the time As I Lay Dying went on, everyone left. So, I mean, I think that kind of speaks volumes to the fact that it's like, it's not necessarily the fact that As I Lay Dying was a prevalent band. It was who they were bringing out. And As I Lay Dying was always good about bringing out good up-and-coming bands or bands that people wanted to see.
Right. No, I agree. And I think that they definitely were kind of getting the old guys in the room treatment. But, and we're going to talk about this.
I think it's where we're going right now.
And then we're going to be done.
By the time Awaken came out and Tim had this shit go down with him trying to put out a hit on his wife, the interesting thing as a result of that has been separating the individual from the entity that is the band. And something that Daniel and I have been talking about leading up to this discussion for the last probably 2 weeks is, so I made the comment earlier in this discussion, and I made the comment to Dan that I bought the reissues of Frail Words Collapse and Shadows Are Security on vinyl. And what's interesting to me has been the fact that so many audiophiles and music fans have been shitting on people for supporting the business of As I Lay Dying, even though it's really just a subsidiary of Metal Blade Records, which owns all the music and so forth. So really you're supporting a label, not so much a band. But everyone's been shitting on the fact that, well, if you buy these records, you're supporting Tim Lambesis, you're supporting a dude who tried to kill his wife. And it's like, never mind the fact that Jordan Mancino, or however you pronounce his last name, He's the other co-founder of the band. He owns half of As I Lay Dying as a name. That's basically what has stopped so far, per what I understand, Tim from going on and starting a new band, or Jordan continuing on with As I Lay Dying once all this shit happened. So my thing has always been the separation of what Tim did versus the lineage of the band, and that's where we're at now. And so my thing has always been, I can separate everything because good music is good music. I mean, if you want to believe everything that's been said about Michael Jackson that's been terrible, cool. If you believe it and you don't like Michael Jackson's music, more power to you. Me, there's 40 fucking years of great music from the Jackson 5, from Off the Wall to Dangerous to Bad to all these records. I can point to a lot of different musicians, fucking Ike and Tina Turner. Ike was a fucking abuser of, Tina Turner and did all this shit. Does that negate what he did as a musician and as a producer and so forth? No. And I think me as a person, I'm able to look past all that because it's more speaking to the person as an artist, not as the person making the art as a person. And I'm kind of interested to talk about this because I think it's something that we've become very relevant of in the last 8 years or so in music culture, between people like Chris Brown and Rihanna and a lot of this other stuff that's coming up in our pop culture. So, I mean, how do you guys feel about this as far as what Tim has done in his personal life and how it's affected As I Lay Dying's musical career?
So there's two different questions there.
Okay, what are they to you?
The first one is As I Lay Dying, the entity, and the individual that is the lead singer.
Okay.
You're absolutely correct. The band is separate from the individual. It stands on its own, and everything that happened prior to the incident is not necessarily tarnished by the incident.
Do you think it helps the fact that all the shit that happened with Tim happened after the fact of everything coming out?
It does, but it only helps it if the band either goes... For most people, step back here. For most people, I would say that it only changes it if the band decides to continue on without Tim.
Okay.
Not
which they sort of
where
did.
he decides he wants to kind of come back and keep doing it. I think that's where it becomes a problem for other people. I will say, though, the difference between that scenario and Michael Jackson specifically is, would you feel that way about Michael Jackson going forward if he'd actually been convicted of any wrongdoing? Whereas Tim most definitely was convicted of wrongdoing. Michael Jackson had a lot of accusations, and he was a weird guy, but there is nothing that says, yes, he did these things that people say he did. And a little bit of discussion with people that were close to him at the time say that that's completely impossible. Logistically.
Discussion with who? With Tim or with Michael Jackson?
When that question came up, the answer that was given was, it's not possible. He was in a completely different hotel than everybody else. He had to be. He was Michael Jackson. So how could that have possibly happened?
Whereas with Tim, he spilt his shit to an undercover cop that recorded all of it.
We are in a world now where we are in a 24-hour news cycle. We over-sensationalize things. Everything that is relevant now is not relevant the next day because the next news story is the new thing. To me, in light of a lot of the music industry, like we already mentioned Michael Jackson, I think we can go through the course of the last 40 years of music industry as a whole and probably can point to so many different things between murder, so on and so forth. And, we get to metal, and metal always gets this weird credit of being bad and evil and so on and so forth. So how much we put on Tim Lambesis is because he's in a metal band versus how much he was a Christian and we want to build people up to rip them down to then maybe see them come back up versus just being generally like, that's fucked up. Like, you are trying to kill your wife. Like, that's terrible.
I think the general population would say you're supposed to be this positive individual, but at the end of the day, you did try to kill your wife. And I think it doesn't matter who you are. if you're a public figure, the general populace would say, yeah, no, I'm done with you.
Oh, it matters who you are.
Yeah, in my opinion, with Tim, I don't care how much good he's done. It means dick. He's a fucker. I mean, that's as simple as I can put it. I'm pretty passionate on this particular one.
Okay.
I hadn't listened to As I Lay Dying for a while because
Because of this?
Absolutely.
Really?
Oh yeah, and no question. And you can ask Toomey. I feel the same way about Pantera because Phil is a piece of shit.
So sorry to cut you off, but it has nothing to, so the fact that Pantera used the Confederate flag leading up to Dime's death, leading up to all this bullshit with Phil, that never swayed you into thinking anything else?
Is mainly because I was ignorant of it.
Okay.
If I would have known, yeah, it would have been that would have been a non-starter because I would. Although the other thing to keep in mind is I was young and impressionable too whenever Pantera was popular in the 80s and 90s. I mean, I was a teenager,
right.
And we also didn't have access to things that we do now that you talked about. You know, it's easier to discover people's faults and mistakes. The only thing it's different is I'm pretty sensitive to bullying, and I view Phil as a bully. I don't put up with bullies. I fucking hate them. Makes me want to fight them. I'm not necessarily Phil himself. I'm just saying that I don't like bullies, and I stood up to bullies all the time as a kid because I don't appreciate what they bring to the table. And whenever I view somebody as a bully, I'm done with you. And I view Tim as a bully because in an obvious nature, he's trying to kill his wife. I mean, that's pretty terrible, you know. And obviously, I don't like the way that Phil goes about certain things because I view him as being a bully as well. But that's just my personal opinion. I don't want to support people's art who I don't like Roman Polanski. So but that's me. Other people can have different perspectives. Other people can look past it. I just simply cannot. Whenever I find those things out about people, yeah, I just turn them off. I had a negative interaction with Anthony Anderson, the comedian. I don't watch anything that guy's in outside of the original, the Michael Bay Transformer. I refuse to watch anything that guy's in. That I just turn the page. That's the easiest way for me to put it, and that's kind of how I feel. Although I will admit, I thoroughly enjoyed listening to the As I Lay Dying discography leading up to this episode. I really enjoyed being able to go back and listen to the music because I do love their music. I just don't like Tim the person, and that just makes it's hard for me to separate the two like you can do. I don't have that luxury. I get too passionate about it, and it's hard for me to separate them. It blurs the lines, and I just can't go forward.
Dan, how do you feel about it? You know, growing up very big in the Christian hardcore scene and obviously having ties to a lot of bands that have been around for a long time and long standing and, you know, like Zao and so forth. How did this impact you? Like, cause like, I feel like you're one of the few people out of the four of us all collectively that can speak to maybe a betrayal as far as how Tim presented himself versus how he actually was.
Well, I think I'm going to make a speech, and I apologize. So
now it's time for a speech.
It's time for a speech. Speech! You can turn this podcast off now if you want.
Crack a beer.
Crack a beer. That's what I would do. So, in Christian metal, Christian hardcore, whatever you want to call it, Geoff, can you grab me another beer?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Can you grab me a Christian beer from the wells
Christian
of the blood
beer.
spilled?
Yeah.
Make sure that's open before you start your rampage.
It's actually before, it's not a rampage. It's really not.
All right.
You're building it up.
I haven't really like revealed how I feel about this really to anyone yet. In music in general, as music fans, we tend to find that person that we attach to, that person that becomes our hero, so to speak. And like for me personally, that's Dan Wyant from Zao. So he's gonna always be my hero in the sense of what he has to say, how he says it, how he presents himself. But I think for a lot of people, especially in Christian music, that person was Tim Lambesis. Tim had a really good way of writing lyrics that were relatable to everyone. Not just Christians, but everyone. And that's a talent that a lot of people don't have, especially whenever you're starting off in that scene, that genre of Christian metal. Whether you want to call As I Lay Dying a Christian metal band or not, that is, I mean, you can prove conclusively that that's what they were, at least on the first 3 records. You know, you can find the references to God, you can find all that stuff. And I think that this feeling of hero worship was very prevalent with As I Lay Dying, which is kind of funny because if you're a Christian metal fan, you're not supposed to idolize human beings. You're supposed to only idolize God, right? So I think what happened was you had a band like this that a lot of people idolized on a global scale. I think that's fair to say, global. Okay. The problem with all of this is that I'm reading Tim's lyrics. I'm huge on lyrics. I remember my wife when her and I were still young and we were dating. I remember her reading some of As I Lay Dying's lyrics and saying that like this was like really good, really profound stuff that she could relate to. And she's not a metal fan, but she totally got into what Tim was saying, lyrically. And I thought that was really cool. I think you take away the lyrics, you take away the music, you take all that away, and you have an individual. And the reality is that for anybody that doesn't know Tim Lambesis personally, you're still stuck with a stranger, somebody that you don't really know, somebody that's not really, you can't predict what they're going to do from one day to another. And I think with Tim, what it was is that he had success. I think that his lyrics were sincere. That's a big point of contention right now, especially in like the Christian world. Was Tim sincere on those first 3 records? I'm going to say he was. Because why would you pour all your time, effort, energy into something that wasn't sincere at that time? Especially if you're talking about Christianity and religion and stuff like that. There's no benefit for you to stick to that ideology. Especially in heavy metal, like that's one of the hardest sells. Is like, hey, we're into Christianity. I mean, I know that's like what metal's supposed to be against or whatever, but that's what we're into, And so I think a lot of Christians identified with that, and they're like, we're going to be bold in the face of adversity. We're going to be really bold. We're going to be in your face. And so I think that's where this Tim Lambesis worship came into play, where it was like, this guy is our torchbearer. He's the guy that, we want to compare ourselves to. This is the guy that we want to be more like. The answer is you're supposed to be more like Jesus, but apparently you guys want to be more like Tim. So that happened. So I think for me, I was pretty surprised when all of this came to light. I mean, I'm not stupid. I read the lyrics to Awaken. I read Tim's blog posts. I kind of had an idea of where he was at spiritually. But the thing for me was that I was kind of going through the same stuff. Like, dude, this faith healing stuff, all this proof that you guys have that it's all true is all bullshit. Like, none of it is really, like, concrete. And for me, I came to a different conclusion than what Tim came to, in that I feel like Christianity and Jesus and God and the Bible and all that is all taken from a perspective of you either choose to believe or you choose not to believe. And there's no amount of proof. Jesus even says it, that, whenever he was first resurrected, or, there was a guy that says, well, I'm not going to believe that Jesus is alive until I see the nail holes in his hands and I see the nail holes in his feet. I have to see that to believe that he actually is the risen Jesus. And Jesus said to him, it's really cool that you believe now that you've seen, but it is greater for those who have believed but not seen, because they're taking it on faith alone. So like that is more powerful to me than, oh, I have concrete proof that all of this stuff is true. I have faith healings, I have Christian Science, I have all this stuff that, if you really look at objectively, is a lot of deception and is a lot of falsifying of facts. So where I'm going with all of this is that Tim was viewed unquestioningly, based on his lyrics, as this great person, this upstanding individual. However, all of us from a very early age can be accused of committing crimes, whether they be on different scales. You know what I mean? Nobody tells a little kid how to lie. You know what I mean? Like I've got a 4-year-old at home, and she'll take something from her sister, and I'll see it, and I'll say, "Did you take that from your sister?" And she'll say, "No." Well, nobody taught her how to act that way. I never told her, "Hey, in order to avoid getting in trouble, you might not want to tell the truth based on what you did." You know what I mean? Like we've never had that conversation, but it is something that is innate in her that says, okay, well, I don't want Dad to get mad at me, so I'm going to say that I did this other thing that I didn't do to cover up for this thing that I did. And so with Tim Lambesis, it's one of those things where what he did can be definitely considered as heinous. This guy went to an individual. They said he was talking about how his wife was causing him grief. He had started a relationship with another woman. He had actually told his wife at this point that he was no longer a Christian. He no longer believed that, which again, his reasons for arriving there, I don't have any issue with. I understand why Tim Lambesis felt that way at that time. I totally get it. However, where him and I fall off theologically is when he decided that, you know what, my wife is trying to keep me from my children because she thinks she's neglectful. And I can tell you as a dad, I love my wife 100%. However, if I didn't, and she told me that she was going to take my children away, I would do everything in my power to prevent that from happening.
So what's interesting to me, though, is about, Tim, as far as everything that we have talked about, as far as, him committing to have his wife murdered, the issues with his kids, being potentially becoming a single dad and so forth. I'm not someone who, I'm married, but I don't have kids like some of you do. So I can't speak to what it's like thinking about the fact of potentially losing my kids. And as someone who doesn't really want kids, I can't really speak to the fact of knowing what that's like. So take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt. But my thing has always been with Tim in regards to the Esley dying thing. It definitely seems like one of the few instances, not only in the metal and hardcore scene, but just in music as a whole, where people seemingly aren't able to separate the individual from the crime that was committed. And interestingly enough, we already mentioned Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson shit was going on in the midst of, I would say, arguably in the twilight of his career, but still kind of in the middle of his career, from the first accusations and on to even you look at people who have gone through some shit like Sonny Bono and Cher being abusive, to Ike and Tina Turner, to Chris Brown and Rihanna, to, there's just so many people in the music industry that have gone through a lot of different shit, whether it be drugs, spousal abuse, whatever. And what's interesting to me is that we seem to hold Tim Lambesis in such a completely different regard than anybody else in the music industry. Like Chris Brown, he quote unquote, was found guilty of beating Rihanna. However, I wonder, and maybe it's just bad timing of a single, but I mean, you have a song like S&M shortly after you accuse your boyfriend of beating you, and I'm like, okay, so maybe your safe word got misunderstood. So he beat you and you had the wrong safe word. But regardless of all that, it's like Chris Brown has come back from all of that and seemingly for the better. Like, he still has a big career. He's putting out top 10 singles, selling out, decent sized arenas and so forth. Yet here we are talking about Tim Lambesis, and he's out of jail, and I don't know if any of you have seen the Wikipedia page was just changed and said, like, Daniel Davidson, formerly of Under Oath and X Every Time I Die, is now the new drummer, and a few other people have now been announced as the new band. But to me, it's like, if As I Lay Dying were to continue as Tim Lambesis and other people, honestly, I'm probably going to go check it out because I love the back catalog and the discography because it happened after everything had been put out. And I don't know if I'm the minority on that or if I'm the majority of that thinking, but I'm interested in talking about that because I think that's such a bigger, honestly, I think it's a bigger thing we're dealing with now in our music between pop culture and so forth. And I think Tim really was the beginning kind of that.
Well, let me get to where I was going. As far as not knowing someone, and like I said, I think that a lot of the reasons why that Tim had for wanting to kill his wife are sadly relatable in the sense that, like, I have a friend right now who's got full custody of her children.
That's Joe.
When the father, who is like one of my best friends of all time, like, no question, she has accused him of something, and now he has to bear the weight of that. And there's nothing that he can feel other than rage, other than being upset. Like, goes back to the whole children thing. So, like, I think that Tim's reasoning for how he got there is relatable to a lot of men right now. Like, I get where he's coming from as far as the rage comes from. I get it. I totally get it. And it's weird is the situation that I'm talking about took place after Tim. So my opinion on it has changed a bit from what it was prior. Because it's one of those things where we live in a day and age, unfortunately, where you can be accused of something. And unfortunately, it's not like a due process type of thing. If you're accused of something, you're guilty. Unless you can be proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that you're innocent. But, like, how hard is it to prove that something didn't happen? And so, like, that's what we're going into with this, is that she says, I'm taking your kids away. You were not a good influence. She said that, Tim's wife, I'm saying, said that he was neglectful of the children. At one point, they were, like, swimming in a pool, and he was so tired that, like, he fell asleep while he was supervising his children in the pool, and that put the children in danger and all that stuff. And so, whenever he sends an email like he sent her saying, I've moved on, I'm not a Christian anymore, I no longer believe in God, and I'm going to start this relationship with this other woman, I can see kind of how the maternal instinct in his wife kicked in and said, well, I need to do what's best for me and my kids, and the best thing to do is to separate myself from Tim, because now I can't predict him because he doesn't follow the same worldview that I follow. And so I understand Tim's frustration. I understand Megan's frustration. I understand it from both sides of the coin. But where it gets weird is whenever he's talking to his gym buddies and he's saying, my life would be much easier if Megan wasn't around anymore. And that's the part that I have trouble with, because I want to say that I'm giving this a fair shake. I'm saying I understand where Tim's coming from. I understand where Megan's coming from. But what I don't understand is how we get to murder. And that's the part, that's what separates us from being animals. And I think, again, Tim's on a lot of steroids, and they're going to cause him to believe something that may not necessarily be true. He might think that she is being unfair to him when maybe she's not. I don't know. I don't know the full extent of that situation because I don't know them personally. But I have seen situations in my own personal life that have been very similar to that. So again, whenever I say I understand where Tim's coming from, I totally do. But there's a flip side to that. Let's just say the guy that Tim contacted wasn't an undercover police officer. Let's say he did it. Let's say somebody went, they killed his wife, and he got away with it. Can you imagine? Again, because at the time, As I Lay Dying was still a band that was supported by the Christian community. Can you imagine if his wife had been tragically killed by somebody, just a random act of violence, a home intruder? Can you imagine, because he had said that he wanted to set up an alibi for himself and that he would have the kids the night that happened, and he gave gate codes and he, all that stuff. And again, this is very cold and calculating, not representative of a totally off-track roid rage type of thing. When you have roid rage, you get pissed off and you beat your wife half to death. And then she puts a restraining order on you because you can't be trusted. This was calculated. This is something that he thought that he could actually get away with. And imagine if he had. Can you imagine the amount of support that would have been thrown Tim's way, in the way of money, in the way of prayers, in the way of support? All the Christians out there would have been like, oh my God, I can't believe you and your children are having to deal with this tragedy. Can you imagine how disgusting that would be? That everybody is supporting Tim and they're being with Tim in his time of need. But he knows personally that it's all bullshit. He knows that he had something to do with it. So it's one of those situations where it's how would he have reacted to that? Would he have accepted the thoughts, accepted the prayers? Oh my God, that's a fucking trope, right? But would he have, gone along with it? Because as far as I know, that's the plan. The plan is she's going to die. People are going to pour out their undying support. And again, let's talk about the powerless rise. Do you think that... No, shit. Let's talk about Awakened. Okay? Can you imagine, that record probably didn't do as well as their prior 2 or 3 releases? So can you imagine what the album sale boom would have been after this tragedy happened? Can you imagine? So, Tim had nothing but profit to make from this situation. And this is coming from the place of somebody that knows and feels like it is kind of understandable how he arrived where he arrived mentally. I get it from a purely philosophical perspective. But that was the plan. He was going to get away with it. He was going to get support, probably a boost in album sales. He would have probably gotten cash donations from people that just wanted to make sure he was doing okay, that he was doing okay with his kids and everything. And he would have gotten away with it scot-free. But that's not what happened, is it? Do you want to interject, John? You look like you're about to just die.
I just want to make sure no one else has anything to say on this.
Okay. Well, I've trained these guys really well not to say anything when I'm going off like this. But
well, that's why I raised my hand.
Yeah,
if you saw, I raised my hand.
Yeah,
so I was like, I have something to say. But if anyone else has anything to say, go ahead and say it now.
Go.
Nope,
Anyone?
go for it.
You got this. The floor is yours, John.
Yep.
All right. So, a few things. Wouldn't it actually be slightly more reprehensible for Tim and collectively everybody to go on under the Christian banner knowing that they are no longer Christians, that they don't adhere to anything that those people are saying? Doesn't it kind of fall under the same umbrella of this shit of what that kind of entails. Even more to the fact, though, I mean, you talk about the thing that's always interesting to me is in this thing, because, you know, as we were talking leading up to this conversation, I'm of the mind I can separate the individual, the artist, from, you know, everything else. And I think we can go back through just time as a whole, and we can talk about artists of all kinds of different mediums, magnitudes, so forth, that are not good people, who are morally reprehensible, and so on and so forth, but that we revere in pretty positive light. Yet seemingly over the last 2018, so to the last 6-7 years, when social media really has become what it's became, I mean, for all intents and purposes, we kind of have forgiven O.J. Simpson for what he did, honestly. There's murders of pop culture icons that we have forgotten about and don't care about. Tupac, Biggie being a big one. Like, that's a new thing. Sorry if that's funny to anybody, but I mean, we're like re-looking at that now in pop culture. Like, there's a USA Network television show, whatever, about all that stuff. That, I mean, you know, there's all these people involved in these tragic situations. And I mean, even if we go, I mean, and again, I'm going to say this, and I'm not very well versed in biblical anything. So, I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong. But I think even the Bible has kind of shown that we are willing to forgive people for things that are not deemed constitutional, for lack of a better word, as long as we can kind of justify it in the end, justify the means. And it's like, you know, you're very aware to point out the fact that as a person with kids and so forth and who's married, that you understand why Tim would do these things as someone who stands to lose his wife, his kids, his livelihood, his family. That I feel like there's a weird thing where it's like all of a sudden it's like, well, you're in a band and you're someone in the entertainment industry, so therefore we should put you to a higher standard than we are as ourselves. However, we will also want to look at you as somebody who is someone that we aspire to be, and someone that represents the common person being able to overcome the obstacles to become a musician on a grander scale or whatever. And it's just weird that, you know, I never experienced this until the reissues of the vinyl came out. And granted, here's the thing. Metal Blade owns those the masters to those records. So at the end of the day, when you see As I Lay Dying, Frail Words Collapse on vinyl reissue, Shadows of Security reissue, guess what? That's Metal Blade Records going like, people want this. Like, fuck it, let's put it out there and make some money because we own the catalog. That's not Tim Lambesis as the owner of the band name going like, fuck, I need money. Like, how can I make money? Because I have a lot of shit I need to pay for. And the other part of that I don't think people understand is, you know, when everyone's like, well, don't support Tim. Well, Tim's not the only one that owns that name. Jordan is the other person that owns 50-50 ownership of the As I Lay Dying name. So even if you don't want to support Tim, you're also fucking Jordan out of the money that he's rightfully owed as a result of owning that name. So I mean, it gets into this weird thing of like, why do you care so much about what Tim did? And why can't you separate it when everyone's seemingly and people in the same realm are able to separate, you know, the Chris Browns of the world and the Ike Turners and and I'll even say like David Geffen fucking Guns N' Roses out of $13 million and just being like, fuck it. If you think you can get this money from us, take us to court. But you know what? You're probably only going to get $3 million, which is what we're offering you. So you can either take this $3 million and be cool with it, or you can like lose out on the $10 million plus that we owe you and just whatever. I mean, it has been proven over the last 30 something years that the music industry is shady as fuck. And I think collectively we can all agree with the people that we have talked to on our podcasts and just knowing shit in general over the course of music history that like music in business doesn't give a fuck about anything. So the fact that so many people are so tied up on what Tim Lambesis is doing when there's so many outside variables, like, well, there's Metal Blade Records who owns all the things. So should they not make money off of the investment they made? Should Jordan, who owns half of As I Lay Dying's name, does he not deserve the money that he invested by putting in all the time and effort into As I Lay Dying? Yeah, some of it's going to go to Tim, but fuck it. Have we all not made terrible decisions in our lives that maybe we have learned and grown from? Isn't that the Christian way, that like you make a mistake and you get absolved from your mistakes because you learn that you made a mistake and it's not who that one mistake doesn't define you? I know murder is a big fucking thing in the Bible and so forth. It's one of the 10 commandments. But I mean, if Tim were to learn from his mistake, like, you know what, I fucked up, and man, I'm gonna atone for this for the rest of my life. I'm gonna try to make my life better, and then all this thing. Who are we to say that he doesn't deserve that second chance?
Well,
I don't think. Sorry, Dan. But,
go ahead, Joe.
This is all me now. I don't think forgiving somebody for their wrongdoing has anything to do with supporting their business ventures.
Even in light of the fact that it's not just solely them who owns the business venture?
That's an unfortunate consequence to the situation that an individual created. This podcast has 3 main hosts. It's me, Dan, and Geoff. If Geoff decides to go out and kill somebody tomorrow, I have to deal with the fact that there's a group of people that will not listen to this podcast because his name is on our episodes.
Do you, and then as a result, change the name of your podcast? Do you try to do basically what the members of As I Lay Dying did when they started Woven War and so forth? And then as a result, do you feel like if the success or decline of the new business venture doesn't live up to the expectations of the previous incarnation of the thing, do you then go like, well, fuck, it was all because of this other person who screwed us?
No, because those are, again, 2 consequences of a situation created by an individual. The smart business decision is distance yourself from the tarnished business.
Distance is darkness.
Unfortunately, the same people that will tell you that you should get yourself away from that tarnished name don't support the new venture as much as they say they do, because people do not support individuals typically. They support an entity, even when that entity is an individual. I know people that buy Panic at the Disco records, even though it's just one guy. Now, if that one guy decides to completely fuck over everybody, which, depending on who you ask, is pretty much what happened, a different group of people will say, well, I don't want to, listen to Panic at the Disco, but then he becomes a solo artist, and now people are going to say, well, it's different, because they look at things differently when it's a different face, when it's a different symbol, when it's a different name. And the answer to the Tim Lambesis As I Lay Dying question will always be, for me, I don't know him personally, so I can't even comment on what he did from a personal standpoint, but knowing what he did, because he was found guilty in a court, I don't have any personal interest in supporting music that he creates today. That doesn't mean he doesn't deserve a second chance. It doesn't mean he doesn't deserve to be forgiven. It doesn't mean any of that. It just means that I don't want to hear what you have to write about today.
Did you find it hard going back listening to the discography leading up to this?
No.
I mean, we kind of talked about that a little bit.
Because for the same reason that you asked the original question, this all came before that. So this is something separate. This is a band that existed, and then the lead singer did something really, really dumb. And I'm hesitant to bring the name up because it might get cut out depending on how I feel when I edit it. Damn it. Dan, I lost the name. Not Lost Prophets.
Lost Prophets.
Oh, Ian Watkins.
Yeah, Lost Prophets is always the one that comes to mind because I've got that self-titled record and I could still listen to it, but yeah, Not interested, man.
I think part of it
No,
is.
hold on. Can I cut you off just for a second, Dan, to ask this question to you? Did you listen to the record that they put out with Geoff from Thursday, or is it still bothers you because it is the entity other than Ian Watkins, but it's still Lost Prophets, and you can't differentiate them from Ian?
That does feel different to me because Ian has nothing to do with it.
Okay.
And I think As I Lay Dying could do the same thing without Tim. But
Hey, I sent a demo.
the same people that we talked about earlier that distance themselves from the individual and support the entity, but then the entity does this and that, the same people will say it's not as good as it used to be. It's unfortunate that Tim did something horrible because now this band is not as good as they once were. There is no winning, unfortunately.
So in today, something that I wanted to bring up too before all of this gets talked about just solely on Tim. So I mean, like I just went and saw Jack Russell's Great White, which basically was just him and a dude playing guitar. It was an acoustic duo basically, and then I went and saw the headliner was Warren. Warren obviously doesn't have their original lead singer because he killed himself. So it is with somebody else, but it's basically the original band with a new guy. So in this situation, obviously the rest of the band that makes up As I Lay Dying became Woven War. Now there is speculation that Tim will go on doing As I Lay Dying, at least in a live setting, until a recorded, thing comes out. Tim will potentially go on with As I Lay Dying as a band that's full of different replacement players. Since the band recorded everything before Tim had all these issues, and if Tim were to go out with a new band playing old material, would you go see it or would you not support it? And then if that's the case and you wouldn't support that, have you gone and supported Woven War? Because that kind of basically echoes the other sentiment that if you don't support Tim, then you support the people because they weren't in the wrong. But if you obviously aren't supporting Woven War because it's not what As I Lay Dying was, like myself, then that means that you're obviously not a fan of the other individual members, and it's not about who is in the band and who did what. If that all makes sense.
That's a lot of questions.
That was two.
I think
The answer is I've listened to Woven War, and it is what it is.
I think it falls short of what As I Lay Dying was. And to me, if Tim is going to continue on with As I Lay Dying, for me, because that is the music that I want to hear, I'm probably going to go support that because that is what I want to hear. Everything else be damned.
Would that be your final thought?
Final thought. Yeah, that would be my final thought.
Dan, what about you?
let's let Geoff go first.
Well, I will say this. I will never support anything that Tim does from here on forward. I'm not a Christian, so I don't feel the need to have to forgive him. I think what he did is inexcusable. Thankfully, he was not able to follow through with what he attempted to do. I am thankful for that, for his ex-wife and for, 3 children, I think it is.
3 adopted kids, yes.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So thankfully, they still have a mother. So that's important to me. I have enjoyed all of the music that I, especially up to An Ocean Between Us. I mean, I love that album. I've listened to that. I can't tell you how many times. It's probably in the hundreds. I really do enjoy their music, but I don't. I have a hard time supporting the individual, one of the individuals that is behind the music. It makes it where it blurs the line, and I have a difficulty separating the two. They're a great band. I think that they really helped bring metalcore to the forefront. They made it popular. They were able to allow other people who normally would not listen to metal be able to listen to music that I love. But as a collective whole, at the end of the day, it is hard to support them because of the things that he did. And like Joe said, all the other individuals, unfortunately, are a victim of circumstance. It's not their fault, but they're kind of stuck in a shitty situation because there's people like me that do enjoy the music, that do feel sorry for those guys, but have no desire to support anything that Tim has done or what Tim will do.
The last thing I'll ask before everyone gets to say this, though. So let's say, obviously, Tim comes back with Esley dying. Everything goes on as it is. Obviously, Woman War hasn't done what people probably thought it was going to. So if the entity that was Esley dying, that led up to the last incarnation of Esley dying, were to come back with Tim, all is forgiven. They go back. And the entity that was Esley dying, as we knew it on the last record that we fell in love with from Shadows of Security on, if that was the band that were to come back with Tim and support what he, hey, he's rehabilitated, he's learned a lot, we think he's whatever they may say he is. If that was the case and the full band that we all grow to love is what comes back out as Esley dying, are you supporting that? Or because that was something I didn't ask.
Absolutely not. And they're, if they have their ability to forgive him and they're able to get together for themselves, perfect. That's great for them. It doesn't affect me. Guy's still a dick to me. So that's just my personal opinion.
Interesting.
Okay, so he did a bad thing. I understand that. And if you want to put the Christianity perspective into it, forgiveness is a major aspect of Christianity. Major. However, let's look at this in a different light for a second. Let's say that you have a family member that sexually molests you as a child. Not saying that's what Tim Lambesis did. I'm not making that connection. But what I'm doing is providing a example. There have been many cases where somebody maybe molests somebody as a child and that person becomes rehabilitated. Okay, and they've admitted that they've done wrong. They've apologized to the individual, the family. They've done everything that they can do. Okay. If you're a Christian, you kind of like you have to forgive everybody, right? Like that's a big thing. You have to forgive everybody, no matter how heinous or no matter how horrible it is. However, you also have to approach that person from here on out with an air of caution because you don't know how rehabilitated they are. You don't know if they're going to hurt you again. You have what they say. And I don't know Tim Lambesis personally. And even as far as the trial and the murder of his wife and everything, I don't necessarily think that it's my place to forgive Tim for a situation that I had nothing to do with. Okay? It's not my place to forgive Tim because, oh my God, he's a fucking rock star that I admired, all that. It's not my place. But I guess, like credit to what you're saying, this is all 100% subjective to who you are as a person. And I have to admit that ever since 2016, the world hasn't made sense to me like it did before. Because I would have assumed that everybody would have taken the same stance that Geoff took on Tim Lambesis. However, we have individuals in power that have done heinous things, and there's a lot of people that are willing to quote unquote forgive and sweep a lot of the shit under the rug. But it's stuff that, like, personally, I'm not okay with. So I think with Tim Lambesis, it's the same thing. I don't think that I could stomach going and seeing As LA Dying with Tim. Because yes, maybe it's all forgiven. Maybe it's all okay. As a testament to what you said about, like, what if they came back with the Shadows lineup and it was with Tim and it was all good and they said he's rehabilitated. Yes, I have to forgive him for that, but it's not necessarily my mission to forget what happened. So I think anything that happens with Tim Lambesis from here on out is kind of needs to be taken with an air of caution. And I think it's also one of those things where if you read interviews with Tim Lambesis, I read everything from when this issue broke all the way till now, all the way until his release from prison. I read his recent blog entry. I read all of it. Yet there still seems to be this tendency by Tim to take what happened and spin it in such a way that it's someone else's fault and that it's not Tim Lambesis' fault. We have not received that public apology. We haven't received that, I fucked up, guys. He said, I'm really sorry for the people that I hurt. He said things like that, but like he hasn't necessarily taken responsibility for his actions. So at this particular point in time, you know, in April of 2018, I'm going to say that I'm still on Geoff's side as far as not supporting Tim, you know, in any of his newer endeavors. The only time that I'm going to support Tim is going to be whenever we get that apology. We get that this was all 100% my fault, and I'm sorry that it happened, and I want to own up to it, and I want to move forward. I think at that point, I might be willing to support Tim. I think prior to that, though, I think it's a really hard decision to make, and I think that the majority of people are going to say that we don't support him until we get that type of public apology. We get some sort of acknowledgement that he realizes that he's wrong. Because let's tie this into the Christianity thing one more time. The whole essence of being a Christian is admitting that you are not perfect, that you cannot follow God's laws. You are incapable of doing so because it's so complex. It's so crazy that nobody could really live up to that standard. Okay? Like that's a fundamental. So to say that I'm perfect, or that, you know, this thing that happened was someone else's fault, was not my fault, doesn't really ring true, because I know, as far as I know, the official record states that Tim returned to Christianity in prison, which is actually a pretty common thing. He hasn't said that personally, but there's been reports or whatever. I don't know how accurate they are. But the thing is that like part of Christianity is admitting fault. Like that's literally your first step. And until Tim takes that first step, I don't necessarily buy anything that he says. So that's kind of where I'm at. Yeah, I'm judging because that's what Christians do, right? And it's, but it's also one of those things that I'm not like willing to judge anybody else as harshly. It's just that I see an individual that got caught, is upset that he got caught. It feels sorry for himself because he got caught. But I don't see somebody that's truly repentant. So until we see the truly repentant Tim, we don't have what we had before. And that, my friends, is my final thought.
I think As I Lay Dying was the standard bearer of metalcore in the early to mid 2000s. I think everything they did was imitated, ripped off, and duplicated song by song, riff by riff by every major metalcore band that came out, and most of the non-major ones. So they're definitely worth listening to. And the band that they were has nothing to do with the individual. Actually, no, I'm done. That's it.
I was going to say, can I pose one last final thought in light of Under Oath coming out with a new record this past week?
God damn it, John.
You have 2 minutes.
No, I'm going to finish this real fast. So Under Oath came out with the reunion tour. They did arguably 2 of their best records with the reunion tour. People came out, sold out shows. I went and covered the show. I went and saw it. It was great. And they put out this new record that everyone seemingly thought they wanted. And the general consensus is it's not as good as the best Under Oath material from 10 years ago, even with the fact that Spencer Chamberlain has lost his faith, that they're not a Christian band anymore, that he's free to use whatever terminology and verbiage he wants to use. It's kind of made me relook at this As I Lay Dying stuff in a completely different realm, because you know, we're all talking about the finality of Tim's actions to the band. But I just really wonder if the band were to get together and everyone in the band were to be like, you know what, we've talked with Tim. We've, you know, realized his heart is pure. He's where he was when we first all joined the band. And if the band were to get together and write a new record, it's like, you know, for as much as we kind of slag on the last, you know, Awakened record, it makes me wonder if like the band were to go either in the most heaviest direction with some of the stuff Tim has been going through, you know, with his religion and crisis of faith and so forth and just everything, if we would look back on it and be like, wow, this is man, you know, fuck Tim for everything he did, but goddamn, if he, and the band didn't come out with just a fucking record that made us go like, you remember when Shadows of Security came out and how we felt about that band? Like, wow. Like, if the band still, the collective unit of the band, in light of everything that they've gone through, couldn't put out a record that just redefines the genre and just puts where it is, whereas an Underoath came back and everyone wanted them to come back and didn't have any ill will toward them, and they put out a record and everyone's like, oh, I wish they would have stayed gone because this isn't very good, and blah, blah, blah. So it just has me really wondering, like, what the state of the metal community would be if As I Lay Dying were to come out that was involved on the last one. If it would be like the best fucking thing we've all heard, where we look back on it after talking about all this, being like, yeah, Tim was a motherfucker, but holy shit, this record was so good. Oh my God, it's my album of the year.
I might feel that way, but I won't tell anybody.
Why? Like, that's the fuck. That's what keeps tripping me up. Is it's like, why? Because we're hung up on the fact that someone has a shady ass past.
Well, first of all, you compared what Underoath is doing to what the Tim Lambesis thing is.
No, I not Tim Lambesis. What As I Lay Dying has gone through.
Okay,
that's what I'm comparing it to. The fact that like when they left.
But okay, Spencer Chamberlain had a difference in opinion about religion, right? Like, but like, is that the same thing as being unrepentant in the potential murder of your spouse? Like, is that the same thing? I can't say that the bands have gone through the same thing.
My thing is this: a fall from grace is a fall from grace, is it not?
Yeah, if you're a Christian.
But for the rest of
the world, I don't think that it's that way. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with what Underoath is doing. I mean, don't get me wrong.
Totally agree, but
musically, there's some sins going on, but I think that like lyrically, like I don't give a shit how Spencer Chamberlain writes lyrics. Like I don't care about that. But
a lot of people do, though.
But what I do care about is if he tries to kill somebody.
A lot of people are getting hung up on the fact that Underoath is no longer a Christian band. Like, I know
Christians are hung up over
it
that.
Is not, it 100% is not the same thing, but it is the same in the fact that a lot of the Christian metal, hardcore, whatever scene feel betrayed by Spencerland by using the word fuck and so forth and being honest with his religion and so forth. And I totally agree. But
Norma Jean said fuck on their newest record. Nobody gave a shit.
Yeah. Again, that kind of speaks more to my thing, is that it's like, it's very weird how the Christian scene feels about supporting and not supporting and being up in arms about one thing over the other. As a whole, I feel like the As I Lay Dying thing, it's a weird anomaly. And that was something I was really looking forward to talking about all of you with, is because I definitely feel like I'm in the minority. And I think that's as best a place as we can leave this. I was
going to say your opinion is recorded and it will air.
Oh, I'm going to get a ton of hate mail, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, let's hope so. That means people listen to it.
Well, I'm going to give everybody in this room a fucking round of applause because this was a badass episode.
Yay!
Hey, I'm really sorry this took 4 hours to get to.
4.5.
It's okay. I've got a delete key.
Let's just spin this real quick. We need your album of the week.
My album of the week?
Yep.
Man, it is shit. I've been all over the place this week. I mean, like, I've been listening to a lot of As I Lay Dying this week.
That's fine.
Actually, you guys go first. Let me think about this for a second.
All right. Since I brought it up, I'll go first.
Okay.
I'm going Napalm Death, Apex Predator, Easy Meat. I knew Dan would like that one.
Mine has been Human Comedy by Unteachers.
Oh, very good.
What is that?
I'll send you a message later.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
Like, not tonight, because it's really fucking late, but tomorrow.
Okay.
Well, John brought up cover records and how awesome they are, so Power Man 5000 copy clones and replicants.
Fuck, you guys are on to me already.
Yeah, we don't waste any time.
Dude, if it's an As I Lay Dying record, it's fine.
No, it honestly isn't. I'm like torn between 3 records I've been listening to this week, which has been Chris Stapleton's Traveler. I've been listening back through This Is Hell's discography, but I would say the most recent one I've been listening to is actually not This Is Hell, but the new what do they call that? Light the Torch, the Light the Torch revival record.
Oh yeah, okay.
Because I talked to Scuzz, their new drummer, and I've been in a weird Deftones funk, so I've been listening to Diamond Eyes a ton lately.
Nice.
So those are my 3. So any of those 3 you want to edit to be my only one, I'm fine with.
We'll take all 3. That's fine.
And on that note, this has been episode 62 of Discography Discussion. Thank you for listening. You can like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at discussmetal. Subscribe to our podcast everywhere you listen to podcasts, including Google Play, iTunes, and Stitcher. Visit discussmetal.com for all things discography discussion, and please send questions and comments to danandjoeshow@gmail.com. If you are not a patron, you can become one at patreon.com/discussmetal. We have some sweet perks. $1 will get you access to the Discography Discussion Patrons feed. We've got album reviews and other special podcasts that come up there every week. Jons Untitled podcast can be found on Facebook and on Twitter, and I believe SoundCloud. Is that correct?
Yeah, you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Jons Untitled Podcast. You can find me on Twitter at Jons Untitled Pod and Gmail at jonsuntitledpod@gmail.com. So if you want to tell me that I was wrong with anything I said tonight about As I Lay Dying, please do, and I will tell you you're a fucking hypocrite.
Oh, good. I'm on that.
And
I'll send you a 40-page
I just also want to say
bulletin.
Dan actually sent me a message saying that, fuck, this was long.
Yep.